The Bride of Lammermoor, Part 2 by Walter Scott. Chapter 23. I will not attempt to describe the mixture of indignation and regret with which Ravenswood left the seat which had belonged to his ancestors. The terms in which Lady Ashton's billet was couched rendered it impossible for him, without being deficient in that spirit of which he perhaps had too much, to remain an instant longer within its walls. The Marquis, who had his share in the affront, was nevertheless still willing to make some efforts at conciliation. He therefore suffered his kinsman to depart alone, making him promise, however, that he would wait for him at the small inn called the Todd's Hole, situated, as our readers may be pleased to recollect, halfway betwixt Ravenswood Castle and Wolf's Crag, and about 5 Scottish miles distant from each. Here the Marquis proposed to join the master of Ravenswood either that night or the next morning. His own feelings would have induced him to have left the castle directly, but he was loth to forfeit, without at least one effort, the advantages which he had proposed from his visit to the Lord Keeper and the Master of. Ravenswood was, even in the very heat of his resentment, unwilling to foreclose any chance of reconciliation which might arise out of the partiality which Sir William Ashton had shown towards him, as well as the intercessory arguments of his noble kinsman. He himself departed without a moment's delay farther than was necessary to make this arrangement. At first he spurred his horse at a quick pace through an avenue of the park, as if, by rapidity of motion, he could stupefy the confusion of feelings with which he was assailed. But as the road grew wilder and more sequestered, and when the trees had hidden the turrets of the castle, he gradually slackened his pace, as if to indulge the painful reflections which he had in vain endeavoured to repress. The path in which he found himself led him to the Mermaiden's Fountain, and to the cottage of Alice, and the fatal influence which superstitious belief attached to the former spot, as well as the admonitions which had been in vain offered to him by the inhabitant of the latter, forced themselves upon his memory. Old saws speak. Truth, he said to himself, and the Mermaiden's Well has indeed witnessed the last act of rashness of the heir of Ravenswood. Alice spoke well, he continued, and I am in the situation which she foretold, or rather, I am more deeply dishonored, not the dependent and ally of the destroyer of my father's house, as the old Sibyl presaged, but the degraded wretch who has aspired to hold that subordinate character, and has been rejected with disdain. We are bound to tell the tale as we have received it, and, considering the distance of the time, and propensity of those through whose mouths it has passed to the marvellous, this could not be called a Scottish story unless it manifested a tinge of Scottish superstition. As Ravenswood approached the solitary fountain, he is said to have met with the following singular adventure. His horse, which was moving slowly forward, suddenly interrupted its steady and composed pace, snorted, reared, and though urged by the spur, refused to proceed, as if some object of terror had suddenly presented itself. On looking to the fountain, Ravenswood discerned a female figure dressed in a white, or rather greyish, mantle, placed on the very spot on which Lucy Ashton had reclined while listening to the fatal tale of love. His immediate impression was that she had conjectured by which path he would traverse the park on his departure, and placed herself at this well-known and sequestered place of rendezvous to indulge her own sorrow and his parting interview. In this belief he jumped from his horse, and, making its bridle fast to a tree, walked hastily towards the fountain, pronouncing eagerly, yet under his breath, the words, "Miss Ashton." "Lucy." The figure turned as he addressed it, and displayed to his wondering eyes the features, not of Lucy Ashton, but of old blind Alice. The singularity of her dress, which rather resembled a shroud than the garment of a living woman, the appearance of her person, larger as it struck him than it usually seemed to be, above all, the strange circumstance of a blind, infirm, and decrepit person being found alone and at a distance from her habitation, considerable, if her infirmities be taken into account, combined to impress him with a feeling of wonder approaching to fear. As he approached, she arose slowly from her seat, held her shriveled hand up as if to prevent his coming more near, and her withered lips moved fast, although no sound issued from them. Ravenswood stopped, and as, after a moment's pause, he again advanced towards her, Alice, or her apparition, moved or glided backwards towards the thicket, still keeping her face turned towards him. The trees soon hid the form from his sight, and, yielding to the strong and terrific impression that the being which he had seen was not of this world, the master of Ravenswood remained rooted to the ground whereon he had stood when he caught his last view of her. At length, summoning up his courage, he advanced to the spot on which the figure had seemed to be seated, but neither was there pressure of the grass nor any other circumstance to induce him to believe that what he had seen was real and substantial. Full of those strange thoughts and confused apprehensions which awaken the bosom of one who conceives he has witnessed some preternatural appearance, the master of Ravenswood walked back towards his horse, frequently, however, looking behind him, not without apprehension, as if expecting that the vision would reappear. But the apparition, whether it was real or whether it was the creation of a heated and agitated imagination, returned not again, and he found his horse sweating and terrified, as if experiencing that agony of fear with which the presence of a supernatural being is supposed to agitate the brute creation. The master mounted and rode slowly forward, soothing his steed from time to time, while the animal seemed internally to shrink and shudder, as if expecting some new object of fear at the opening of every glade. The rider, after a moment's consideration, resolved to investigate the matter further. "Can my eyes have deceived me," he said, "and deceived me for such a space of time? Or are this woman's infirmities but feigned, in order to excite compassion? And even then her motion resembled not that of a living and existing person. Must I adopt the popular creed, and think that the unhappy being has formed a league with the powers of darkness? I am determined to be resolved. I will not brook imposition even from my own eyes." In this uncertainty he rode up to the little wicket of Alice's garden. Her seat beneath the birch tree was vacant, though the day was pleasant and the sun was high. He approached the hut, and heard from within the sobs and wailing of a female. No answer was returned when he knocked, so that after a moment's pause he lifted the latch and entered. It was indeed a house of solitude and sorrow. Stretched upon her miserable pallet lay the corpse of the last retainer of the house of Ravenswood, who still abode on their paternal domains. Life had but shortly departed, and the little girl by whom she had been attended in her last moments was wringing her hands and sobbing, betwixt childish fear and sorrow, over the body of her mistress. The master of Ravenswood had some difficulty to compose the terrors of the poor child, whom his unexpected appearance had at first rather appalled than comforted, and when he succeeded, the first expression which the girl used intimated that he had come too late. Upon inquiring the meaning of this expression, he learned that the deceased, upon the first attack of the mortal agony, had sent a peasant to the castle to beseech an interview of the master of Ravenswood, and had expressed the utmost impatience for his return. But the messengers of the poor are tardy and negligent. The fellow had not reached the castle, as was afterwards learned, until Ravenswood had left it, and had then found too much amusement among the retinue of the strangers to return in any haste to the cottage of Alice. Meantime her anxiety of mind seemed to increase with the agony of her body, and, to use the phrase of baby, her only attendant, she prayed powerfully that she might see her master's son once more and renew her warning. She died just as the clock in the distant village told one, and Ravenswood remembered with internal shuddering that he had heard the chime sound through the wood just before he had seen what he was now much disposed to consider as the spectre of the deceased. It was necessary, as well from his respect to the departed as in common humanity to her terrified attendant, that he should take some measures to relieve the girl from her distressing situation. The deceased, he understood, had expressed a desire to be buried in the solitary churchyard near the little inn of the Todd's Hole, called the Hermitage, or more commonly Armitage, in which lay interred some of the Ravenswood family and many of their followers. Ravenswood conceived it his duty to gratify this predilection, commonly found to exist among the Scottish peasantry, and dispatched Baby to the neighboring village to procure the assistance of some females, assuring her that in he nobly. Thus, in the course of a quarter of an hour or little more, he found himself sitting a solitary guard over the inanimate corpse of her whose dismissed spirit, unless his eyes had strangely deceived him, had so recently manifested itself before him. Notwithstanding his natural courage, the master was considerably affected by a concurrence of circumstances so extraordinary. She died expressing her eager desire to see me. Can it be, then, was his natural course of reflection, can strong and earnest wishes, formed during the last agony of nature, survive its catastrophe, surmount the awful bounds of the spiritual world, and place before us its inhabitants in the hues and coloring of life? And why was that manifested to the eye, which could not unfold its tale to the ear? And wherefore should a breach be made in the laws of nature, yet its purpose remain unknown? Vain questions, which only death, when it shall make me like the pale and withered form before me, can ever resolve. He laid a cloth as he spoke over the lifeless face upon whose features he felt. Unwilling any longer to dwell, he then took his place in an old carved oaken chair, ornamented with his own armorial bearings, which Alice had contrived to appropriate to her own use in the pillage which took place among creditors, officers, domestics, and messengers of the law, when his father left Ravenswood Castle for the last time. Thus seated, he banished, as much as he could, the superstitious feelings which the late incident naturally inspired. His own were sad enough, without the exaggeration of supernatural terror, since he found himself transferred from the situation of a successful lover of Lucy Ashton and an honored and respected friend of her father into the melancholy and solitary guardian of the abandoned and forsaken corpse of a common pauper. He was relieved, however, from his sad office sooner than he could reasonably have expected, considering the distance betwixt the hut of the deceased and the village, and the age and infirmities of 3 old women who came from thence, in military phrase, to relieve guard upon the body of the defunct. On any other occasion, the speed of these reverend sibyls would have been much more moderate, for the first was 80 years of age and upwards, the second was paralytic, and the third lame of a leg from some accident. But the burial duties rendered to the deceased are, to the Scottish peasant of either sex, a labor of love. I know not whether it is from the temper of the people, grave and enthusiastic as it certainly is, or from the recollection of the ancient Catholic opinions, when the funeral rites were always considered as a period of festival to the living, but feasting, good cheer, and even inebriety were and are the frequent accompaniments of a Scottish old-fashioned burial. What the funeral feast, or dirge as it is called, was to the men, the gloomy preparations of the dead body for the coffin were to the women. To straight the contorted limbs upon a board used for that melancholy purpose, to array the corpse in clean linen, and over that in its woolen shroud, were operations committed always to the old matrons of the village, and in which they found a singular and gloomy delight. The old women paid the master their salutations with a ghastly smile, which reminded him of the meeting betwixt Macbeth and the witches on the blasted heath of Forres. He gave them some money, and recommended to them the charge of the dead body of their contemporary, an office which they willingly undertook, intimating to him at the same time that he must leave the hut in order that they might begin their mournful duties. Ravenswood readily agreed to depart, only tarrying to recommend to them due attention to the body, and to receive information where he was to find the sexton or beadle, who had in charge the deserted churchyard of the Armitage, in order to prepare matters for the reception of old Alice in the place of repose which she had selected for herself. "You'll no be pinched to find out Johnny March you," said the elder Sybil, and still her withered cheek bore a grisly smile. "He dwells near the Todd's Hole, an house of entertainment where there has been mony a blithe birling, for death and drink draining are near neighbours to an either, and either." "Aye, aye, and that's e'en true, cummer," said the lame hag, propping herself with a crutch which supported the shortness of her left leg, "for I mind when the father of this Master of Ravenswood that is now standing before us sticked young Blackhall with his whinger for a rang words that hour their wine, or brandy, or what not, he gaed in as light as a lark, and he came out was a feet foremost. I was at the winding of the corpse, and when the bluid was washed off, he was a bonny buck of man's body." It may be easily believed that this ill-timed anecdote hastened the master's purpose of quitting a company so evil-omened and so odious. Yet, while walking to the tree to which his horse was tied, and busying himself with adjusting the girths of the saddle, he could not avoid hearing, through the hedge of the little garden, a conversation respecting himself betwixt the lame woman and the octogenarian Sybil. The pair had hobbled into the garden to gather rosemary, southernwood, rue, and other plants proper to be strewed upon the body and burned by way of fumigation in the chimney of the cottage. The paralytic wretch, almost exhausted by the journey, was left guard upon the corpse, lest witches or fiends might play their sport with it. The following croaking dialogue was necessarily overheard by the Master of Ravenswood. "That's a fresh and full-grown hemlock, Annie Winnie. Money, a cummer lang syne wad hae sought nae better horse to flee over hill and how through mist and moonlight and light down in the King of France's cellar. Ay, cummer, but the very deil has turned as hard-hearted now as the Lord Keeper and the grit folk that hae breasts like whinstane. They prick us and they pine us, and they pit us on the pennywinkles for witches. And, if I say my prayers backwards 10 times hour, Satan will never gie me amends o' them." "Did ye ever see the foul thief?" asked her neighbour. "Na," replied the other spokeswoman, "but I trow I he dreamed of him mony a time, and I think the day will come they will burn me for tant. But ne'er mind, coomer, we hae this dollar of the master's, and we'll send down for bread, and for yill, and tobacco, and a drack brandy to burn, and a wee pickle saft sugar, and be their deal, or nae deal, lass, we'll hae a merry night o' deal. Lass, we'll hae a merry night o't." Here her leathern chops uttered a sort of cackling, ghastly laugh, resembling to a certain degree the cry of the screech owl. "He's a frank man, and a free-handed man, the master," said Annie Winnie, "and a comely personage broad in the shouters, and narrow around the lunnies. He wad mak a bonny corpse. I wad like to hae the striking and winding o' him." "It is written on his brow, Annie Winnie," returned the octogenarian, her companion. "That hand of woman, or of man either, will never straught him. Dead deal will never be laid on his back. Make you your market of that, for I hae it frae a sure hand." "Will it be his lot to die on the battle-ground then, Ailsie Gourlay? Will he die by the sword or the ball, as his forebears had doen before him, mony an ae o' them?" "Ask nae mair questions about it. He'll no be graced sae far," replied the sage. "I ken ye are wiser than ither folk, Ailsie Gourlay. But what telled ye this?" "Fashion your thumb about that, Annie Winnie," answered the Sybil. "I hae it frae a hand sure end." "But you said you never saw the foul thief," reiterated her inquisitive companion. "I hae it frae as sure a hand," said Ailsie, "and frae them that sped his fortune before the sark gied ower his head. Hark! I hear his horse's feet riding aff," said the other. "They dinna sound as if good luck was with them." "Mak haste, sirs," cried the paralytic hag from the cottage, and let us do what is needful, and say what is fitting, for if the dead corpse bin estrated, it will gurn and thrall, and that will fear the best o' us." Ravenswood was now out of hearing. He despised most of the ordinary prejudices about witchcraft, omens, and vaticination, to which his age and country still gave such implicit credit that to express a doubt of them was accounted a crime equal to the unbelief of Jews or Saracens. He knew also that the prevailing belief concerning witches, operating upon the hypochondriac habits of those whom age, infirmity, and poverty rendered liable to suspicion, enforced by the fear of death and the pangs of the most cruel tortures, often extorted those confessions which encumber and disgrace the criminal records of Scotland during the 17th century. But the vision of that morning, whether real or imaginary, had impressed his mind with a superstitious feeling which he in vain endeavored to shake off. The nature of the business which awaited him at the little inn called Todd's Hole, where he soon after arrived, was not of a kind to restore his spirits. It was necessary he should see Mordshew, the sexton of the old burial ground at Armitage, to arrange matters for the funeral of Alice. And, as the man dwelt near the place of her late residence, the master, after a slight refreshment, walked towards the place where the body of Alice was to be deposited. It was situated in the nook formed by the eddying sweep of a stream which issued from the adjoining hills. A rude cavern in an adjacent rock, which, in the interior, was cut into the shape of a cross, formed the hermitage, where some Saxon saint had in ancient times done penance and given name to the place. The rich abbey of Coldinghame had, in latter days, established a chapel in the neighborhood, of which no vestige was now visible, though the churchyard which surrounded it was still, as upon the present occasion, used for the interment of particular persons. One or two shattered yew trees still grew within the precincts of that which had once been holy ground. Warriors and barons had been buried there of old, but their names were forgotten, and their monuments demolished. The only sepulchral memorials which remained were the upright headstones which marked the graves of persons of inferior rank. The abode of the sexton was a solitary cottage adjacent to the ruined wall of the cemetery, but so low that, with its thatch, which nearly reached the ground, covered with a thick crop of grass, fog, and house leeks, it resembled an overgrown grave. On inquiry, however, Ravenswood found that the man of the last mattock was absent at her bridal, being fiddler as well as grave digger to the vicinity. He therefore retired to the little inn, leaving a message that early next morning he would again call for the person whose double occupation connected him at once with the house of mourning and the house of feasting. An outrider of the Marquess arrived at Todd's Hole shortly after, with a message intimating that his master would join Ravenswood at that place on the following morning, and the master, who would otherwise have proceeded to his old retreat at Wolf's Crag, remained there accordingly to give meeting to his noble kinsman. Chapter 24. The sleep of Ravenswood was broken by ghastly and agitating visions, and his waking intervals disturbed by melancholy reflections on the past and painful anticipations of the future. He was perhaps the only traveler who ever slept in that miserable kennel without complaining of his lodgings or feeling inconvenience from their deficiencies. It is when the mind is free the body's delicate. Morning, however, found the master an early riser, and hopes that the fresh air of the dawn might afford the refreshment which night had refused him. He took his way towards the solitary burial ground, which lay about half a mile from the inn. The thin blue smoke, which already began to curl upward and to distinguish the cottage of the living from the habitation of the dead, apprised him that its inmate had returned and was stirring. Accordingly, on entering the little churchyard, he saw the old man laboring in a half-made grave. My destiny, thought Ravenswood, seems to lead me to scenes of fate and of death, but these are childish thoughts, and they shall not master me. I will not again suffer my imagination to beguile my senses. The old man rested on his spade as the master approached him, as if to receive his commands, and as he did not immediately speak, the sexton opened the discourse in his own way. "Ye will be a wedding customer, sir, I's warrant." "What makes you think so, friend?" replied the master. "I live by twa trades, sir," replied the blithe old man. "Fiddle, sir, and spade, filling the world and emptying of it, and I sold ken baith cast of customers by headmark and 30 years' practice." "You are mistaken, however, this morning," replied Ravenswood. "Am I?" said the old man, looking keenly at him. "Troth and it may be, since for as brent as your brow is, there is something sitting upon it this day that is as near akin to death as to wedlock. Weel, weel, the pick and shovel are as ready to your order as bow and fiddle." "I wish you," said Ravenswood, "to look after the decent interment of an old woman, Alice Gray, who lived at the Graigfoot in Ravenswood Park." "Alice Gray, blind Alice," said the sexton. "And is she gane at last?" "That's another jow of the bell to bid me be ready. I mind when Habby Gray brought her down to this land. A likely lass she was then, and looked ower her Southland knows it as a. I trow her pride got a downcome." "And is she in gain?" "She died yesterday," said Ravenswood, "and desired to be buried here beside her husband. You know where he lies, no doubt." "Ken where he lies," answered the sexton, with national indirection of response. "I ken where a body lies, that lies here, but you were speaking o' her grave? Lord help us, it's no an ordinary grave that will haud her in, if a's true that folk said of Alice in her old days, and if I gaed is 6 feet deep and a warlock's grave shouldna be an inch mair ebb, or her ain't which comers would soon whirl her out of her shroud for a their old acquaintance, and be 6 feet, or be 3, ways to pay the making o't, I pray ye." "I will pay that, my friend, and all other reasonable charges." "Reasonable charges," said the sexton. "All there's grun-mail and bell-siller, though the bell's broken, nae doubt, and the kist, and my day's wark and my bit fee, and some brandy and yill to the dergie. I am no thinking that you can inner her to decently under 16 pundake Scots." "There is the money, my friend," said Ravenswood, "and something over. Be sure you know the grave." "You'll be a nun. Her English relations, I's warrant," said the hoary man of skulls. "I hae heard she married far below her station. It was very right to let her bite on the bridle when she was living, and it's very right to gie her a decent burial now she's dead, for that's a matter of credit to yoursel rather than to her. Folk may let their kindred ship for themselves when they are alive and can bear the burden of their ain't misdoings, but it's an unnatural thing to let them be buried like dogs, when the discredit gangs to the kindred. What kens the dead corpse about it? You would not have people neglect their relations on a bridal occasion neither," said Ravenswood, who was amused with the professional limitation of the grave digger's philanthropy. The old man cast up his sharp grey eyes with a shrewd smile, as if he understood the jest, but instantly continued, with his former gravity. "Bridals what neglect, bridals that had ony regard for plenishing the earth? To be sure, they sold. Be celebrated with all manner of good cheer, and meeting of friends, and musical instruments, harp, sackbut, and psaltery, or goude fiddle and pipes, when these old-world instruments of melody are hard to be compassed." "The presence of the fiddle, I dare say," replied Ravenswood, "would atone for the absence of all the others." The sexton again looked sharply up at him as he answered, "Nae doubt thee, nae doubt if it were weel played, but yonder," he said, as if to change the discourse, "is Halbert Gray's lang hame that you were speering after, just the third bourock beyond the Mucklethrew Stane that stands on Saxlegs yonder, aboon some ane of their Ravenswoods, for there is mony of their kin and followers here. Dale lift them, though it isna just their main burial place." "They are no favourites then of yours, these Ravenswoods?" said the master, not much pleased with the passing benediction which was thus bestowed on his family and name. "I ken now why should favour them," said the grave digger. "When they had lands and power, they were ill guides of them baith, and now their heads down, there's few care how lang they may be of lifting it again." "Indeed," said Ravenswood, "I never heard that this unhappy family deserved ill will at the hands of their country. I grant their poverty, if that renders them contemptible." "It will gang a far way till," said the sexton of Hermitage, "ye may tak my word for that. At least I ken naething else that sould mak myself contemptible, and folk are far frae respecting me as they wad do if I lived in a twa lofted skladed house. But as for the Ravenswoods, I hae seen 3 generations of them, and dale an end to mend other." "I thought they had enjoyed a fair character in the country," said their descendant. "Character! Woo, you see, sir," said the sexton, "as for the all goods hair body of a lord, I lived on his land when I was a swanking young shield, and could hae blown the trumpet wy ony body, for I had wind and knew then, and touching this trumpeter marine that I have heard play afore the lords of the circuit, I wad hae made ne'er o' him than of a bairnin at bawbee whistle. I defy him to he played boot and saddle, or horse and away, or gallants come trot with me. He handa the tones. But what is all this to old Lord Ravenswood, my friend?" said the master, who, with an anxiety not unnatural in his circumstances, was desirous of prosecuting the musician's first topic. What had his memory to do with the degeneracy of the trumpet music? "Just this, sir," answered the sexton, "that I lost my wind in his service. Ye see, I was trumpeter at the castle, and had allowance for blawing at break of day and at dinner time, and other whiles when there was company about, and it pleased my lord. And when he raised his militia to caper awa to Bothwell Brig against the wrang-headed Westland Whigs, I behoved, reason or name, to munt a horse and caper awa them." "And very reasonable," said Ravenswood. "You were his servant and vassal." "Servitor, say ye," replied the sexton. "And so I was, but it was to blaw folk to their warm dinner, or at the warres to a decent kirkyard, and no to skirl them awa to a bloody braeside, where there was dale a bedrawal but the hooded craw. But bide ye shall hear what cam oot, and how far I am bun to be budisman to the Ravenswoods. Tillant, ye see, we gaed on a braw, simmer morning, 24th of June, 1679, of the days of the month and year. Drums beat, guns rattled, horses kicked and trampled. Hackston of Rothalit keepeth the brig wi' muskeet, and carabine and pike, sword and scythe, for what I ken, and we horsemen were ordered down to cross at the ford. I hate fords at a times, let a be when there's thousands of armed men on the other side. There was old Ravenswood brandishing his Andrew Ferrara at the head, and crying to us to come and buckle to, as if we had been gwan to a fair. There was Caleb Balderstone, that is living yet, flourishing in the rear, and swearing Gog and Magog, he would put steel through the guts of ony man that turned bridle. There was young Alan Ravenswood, that was then master, why bended pistol in his hand. It was a mercy, it gaed na crying to me that had scarce as much wind left as served the necessary purpose of my 8 lungs. "Sound, you poltroon! Sound, you damned cowardly villain, or I will blow your brains out." And, to be sure, I blew sick points of war that the scrowl of a clockin hen was music to them. "Well, sir, cut all this short," said Ravenswood. "Short. I had like to have been cut short mysel', in the flower of my youth, as Scripture says, and that's the very thing that I complain o'. Weel, and o' which the league between glasses of the West for the Androids, that my widers flood out was story, and lighted father of the parsons and what sherrod, and a had a lot to avoid to them a fell the hullumings that he failed at them like heart of funny she had of a pad double video babaka him one that says of a. "You were rather obliged to the old lord, I think," said Ravenswood. "Was I, my sartie? First for bringing me into jeopardy. Would I null die? And then for whomling the child on the table me, that dane the very wind out of my body? I he been short-breathed ever since, and canna gain 20 yards without pegging like a miller's ivor. You lost, then, your place as trumpeter, said Ravenswood. Lost it? To be sure I lost it, replied the sexton, for I couldna hae played pew upon a dry henlock, but I might hae doon weel, for I keep it the wage in the free house, and little to do but play on the fiddle to them, but for Allan, last Lord Ravenswood, that was far worse than ever his father was. What, said the master, did his father's son, this last Lord Ravenswood, deprive you of what the bounty of his father allowed you? Aye, troth, did he, answered the old man, for he loot his affairs gang to the dogs, and let in this Sir William Ashton on us, that will gee neithing for neithing, and just removed me and a pure creatures that had bite and soup at the castle, and a hole to put our heads in, when things were in the eld way. If Lord Ravenswood protected his people, my friend, while he had the means of doing so, I think they might spare his memory, replied the master. Ye are welcome to your ain opinion, sir, said the sexton, but ye winna persuade me that he did his duty, either to himsel or to his pure dependent creatures, in guiding us the gate he has done. He might hae gien us life-rent tax of our bits o' houses and yards, and me, that's an old man, living in yon miserable cabin, that's fitter for the dead than the quick, and killed Wyrunstudies, and John Smith in my dainty bit mailing, and his window grazing, and John a spa-pie. It is but too true, said Ravenswood, conscience struck, the penalties of extravagance extend far beyond the prodigal's own sufferings. However, said the sexton, this young man Edgar is like to avenge my wrangs on the hale of his kindred. Indeed, said Ravenswood. Why should you suppose so? They say he is about to marry the daughter of Letty Ashton, and let her Lettyship get his head ants under her oxter, and see you if she winna gee his neck a thraw. Sorra a bit, if I were him. Let her alane for hauding is something in it, water that draws near her. Say the worst wish I shall wish the lad is, that he may take his increditable gait out, and ally himsel wi' his father's enemies, that have taken his broad lands, and my bonny Kelyard, from the lawful owners thereof. Cervantes acutely remarks that flattery is pleasing even from the mouth of a madman, and censure as well as praise often affects us, while we despise the opinions and motives on which it is founded and expressed. Ravenswood, abruptly reiterating his command that Alice's funeral should be attended to, flung away from the sexton under the painful impression that the great as well as the small vulgar would think of his engagement with Lucy like this ignorant and selfish peasant. And I have stooped to subject myself to these calumnies, and am rejected notwithstanding. Lucy, your faith must be true and perfect as the diamond to compensate for the dishonor which men's opinions and the conduct of your mother attach to the heir of Ravenswood. As he raised his eyes, he beheld the Marquis of A., who, having arrived at the Todd's Hole, had walked forth to look for his kinsman. After mutual greetings, he made some apology to the master for not coming forward on the preceding evening. It was his wish, he said, to have done so, but he had come to the knowledge of some matters which induced him to delay his purpose. I find, he proceeded, there has been a love affair here, kinsman, and though I might blame you for not having communicated with me, as being in some degree the chief of your family, with your lordship's permission, said Ravenswood, I am deeply grateful for the interest you are pleased to take in me, but I am the chief and head of my family. I know it, said the Marquis. In a strict heraldic and genealogical sense, you certainly are so. What I mean is, that being in some measure under my guardianship, I must take the liberty to say, my lord, answered Ravenswood, and the tone in which he interrupted the Marquis boded no long duration to the friendship of the noble relatives, when he himself was interrupted by the little sexton, who came puffing after them to ask if their honors would choose music at the change house to make up for short cheer. "We want no music," said the master abruptly. "Your honor disna ken what you're refusing then," said the fiddler with the impertinent freedom of his profession. "I can play, wilt thou do't again, and the old man's mere's dead, 6 times better than ever, Paddy Burney. I'll get my fiddle in the turning of a coffin screw." "Take yourself away, sir," said the Marquis. "And if your honor be a north country gentleman," said the persevering minstrel, "whilk I wad judge from your tongue, I can play Liggeram Cosh and Mullindew and the Cummers of Athol." "Take yourself away, friend. You interrupt our conversation." "Or if, under your honor's favour, ye should happen to be a thought honest, I can play this in a low and confidential tone Killiecrankie, and the king shall hae his ain't, and the old stort's back again, and the wife at the change house is a decent, discreet body, neither kins nor cares what toasts are drucken and what tunes are played. In her house she's deaf to a thing but the clink o' the siller." The Marquis, who was sometimes suspected of Jacobitism, could not help laughing as he threw the fellow $1 and bid him go play to the servants if he had a mind, and leave them at peace. "All weel, gentlemen," said he, "I am wishing your honours good day. I'll be a the better of the $1, and you'll be the waur of wanting music, I's tell ye. But I's gang hame, and finish the grave in the tuning o' a fiddle string. Lay by my spade, and then get my t'other breadwinner and a wad o' your folk, and see if they hae better lugs than their masters." Chapter 25. Hendersown. "I wish to tell you, my good kinsman," said the Marquis, "now that we are quit of that impertinent fiddler, that I had tried to discuss this love affair of yours with Sir William Ashton's daughter. I never saw the young lady but for a few minutes today, so being a stranger to her personal merits, I pay a compliment to you, and offer her no offence in saying you might do better. My lord, I am much indebted for the interest you have taken in my affairs," said Ravenswood. "I did not intend to have troubled you in any matter concerning Miss Ashton. As my engagement with that young lady has reached your lordship, I can only say that you must necessarily suppose that I was aware of the objections to my marrying into her father's family, and of course must have been completely satisfied with the reasons by which these objections are overbalanced, since I have proceeded so far in the matter." "Nay, master, if you had heard me out," said his noble relation, "you might have spared that observation, for, without questioning that you had reasons which seemed to you to counterbalance every other obstacle, I set myself, by every means that it became me to use towards the Ashtons, to persuade them to meet your views." "I am obliged to your lordship for your unsolicited intercession," said Ravenswood, "especially as I am sure your lordship would never carry it beyond the bounds which it became me to use." "Of that," said the Marquis, "you may be confident. I myself felt the delicacy of the matter too much to place a gentleman nearly connected with my house in a degrading or dubious situation with these Ashtons. But I pointed out all the advantages of their marrying their daughter into a house so honourable and so nearly related with the first of Scotland. I explained the exact degree of relationship in which the Ravenswoods stand to ourselves, and I even hinted how political matters were like to turn, and what cards would be trumps next, Parliament. I said I regarded you as a son or a nephew, or so rather than as a more distant relation, and that I made your affair entirely my own." "And what was the issue of your lordship's explanation?" said Ravenswood, in some doubt whether he should resent or express gratitude for his interference. "Why, the Lord Keeper would have listened to reason," said the Marquis. "He is rather unwilling to leave his place, which, in the present view of a change, must be vacated, and, to say truth, he seemed to have a liking for you, and to be sensible of the general advantages to be attained by such a match. But his lady who is ton of the trump—" "Master, what of Lady Ashton, my lord?" said Ravenswood. "Let me know the issue of this extraordinary conference. I can bear it." I am glad of that, kinsman, said the Marquis, for I am ashamed to tell you half what she said. It is enough her mind is made up, and the mistress of a first-rate boarding school could not have rejected with more haughty indifference the suit of a half-pay Irish officer, beseeching permission to wait upon the heiress of a West India planter, than Lady Ashton spurned every proposal of mediation, which it could at all become me to offer in behalf of you, my good kinsman. I cannot guess what she means. A more honorable connection she could not form, that's certain. As for money and land, that used to be her husband's business rather than hers. I really think she hates you for having the rank which her husband has not, and perhaps for not having the lands that her good man has. But I should only vex you to say more about it here we are at the change house. The master of Ravenswood paused as he entered the cottage, which reeked through all its crevices, and they were not few, from the exertions of the Marquis's travelling cooks to supply good cheer and spread, as it were, a table in the wilderness. My Lord Marquis, said Ravenswood, I already mentioned that accident has put your lordship in possession of a secret which, with my consent, should have remained one even to you, my kinsman, for some time. Since the secret was to part from my own custody, and that of the only person besides who was interested in it, I am not sorry it should have reached your lordship's ears, as being fully aware that you are my noble kinsman and friend. You may believe it is safely lodged with me, Master of Ravenswood, said the Marquis. But I should like well to hear you say that you renounce the idea of an alliance which you can hardly pursue without a certain degree of degradation. Of that, my lord, I shall judge, answered Ravenswood, and I hope with delicacy as sensitive as any of my friends. But I have no engagement with Sir William and Lady Ashton. It is with Miss Ashton alone that I have entered upon the subject, and my conduct in the matter shall be entirely ruled by hers. If she continues to prefer me in my poverty to the wealthier suitors whom her friends recommend, I may well make some sacrifice to her sincere affection. I may well surrender to her the less tangible and less palpable advantages of birth, and the deep-rooted prejudices of family hatred. If Miss Lucy Ashton should change her mind on a subject of such delicacy, I trust my friends will be silent on my disappointment, and I shall know how to make my enemies so. Spoke like a gallant young nobleman, said the Marquis. For my part, I have that regard for you that I should be sorry the thing went on. This Sir William Ashton was a pretty enough pettifogging kind of a lawyer 20 years ago, and betwixt battling at the bar and leading in committees of Parliament, he has got well on. The Darien matter lent him a lift, for he had good intelligence and sound views, and sold out in time. But the best work is had out of him. No government will take him at his own, or rather, his wife's extravagant valuation, and betwixt his indecision and her insolence, from all I can guess, he will outsit his market and be had cheap when no one will bid for him. I say nothing of Miss Ashton, but I assure you a connection with her father will be neither useful nor ornamental. Beyond that part of your father's spoils which he may be prevailed upon to disgorge by way of torture, good, and take my word for it, you will get more if you have spirit to bell the cat with him in the House of Peers. And I will be the man, cousin, continued his lordship, will course the fox for you, and make him rue the day that ever he refused a composition too honorable for him, and proposed by me on the behalf of a kinsman. There was something in all this that, as it were, overshot the mark. Ravenswood could not disguise from himself that his noble kinsman had more reasons for taking offense at the reception of his suit than regarded his interest and honor, yet he could neither complain nor be surprised that it should be so. He contented himself, therefore, with repeating that his attachment was to Miss Ashton. Personally, that he desired neither wealth nor aggrandizement from her father's means and influence, and that nothing should prevent his keeping his engagement, excepting her own express desire that it should be relinquished, and he requested as a favor that the matter might be no more mentioned betwixt them at present, assuring the Marquis of A that he should be his confidant in its progress or its interruption. The Marquis soon had more agreeable, as well as more interesting, subjects on which to converse. A footpost, who had followed him from Edinburgh to Ravenswood Castle, and had traced his steps to the Todd's Hole, brought him a packet laden with good news. The political calculations of the Marquis had proved just, both in London and at Edinburgh, and he saw almost within his grasp the pre-eminence for which he had panted. The refreshments which the servants had prepared were now put on the table, and an epicure would perhaps have enjoyed them with additional zest from the contrast which such fare afforded to the miserable cabin in which it was served up. The turn of conversation corresponded with and added to the social feelings of the company. The Marquis expanded with pleasure on the power which probably incidents were likely to assign to him, and on the use which he hoped to make of it in serving his kinsman Ravenswood. Ravenswood could but repeat the gratitude which he really felt, even when he considered the topic as too long dwelt upon. The wine was excellent, notwithstanding its having been brought in a runlet from Edinburgh, and the habits of the Marquis, when engaged with such good cheer, were somewhat sedentary, and so it fell out that they delayed their journey 2 hours later than was their original purpose. "But what of that, my good young friend?" said the Marquis. "Your castle of Wolf's Crag is at but 5 or 6 miles distance, and will afford the same hospitality to your kinsman of A that it gave to this same Sir William Ashton." "Sir William took the castle by storm," said Ravenswood, "and, like many a victor, had little reason to congratulate himself on his conquest." "Well, well," said Lord A, whose dignity was something relaxed by the wine he had drunk, "I see I must bribe you to harbour me. Come, pledge me in a bumper health to the last young lady that slept at Wolf's Crag and liked her quarters. My bones are not so tender as hers, and I am resolved to occupy her apartment tonight, that I may judge how hard the couch is that love can soften." "Your lordship may choose what penance you please," said Ravenswood, "but I assure you I should expect my old servant to hang himself, or throw himself from the battlements, should your lordship visit him so unexpectedly. I do assure you we are totally and literally unprovided." But his declaration only brought from his noble patron an assurance of his own total indifference as to every species of accommodation, and his determination to see the tower of Wolf's Crag. His ancestor, he said, had been feasted there when he went forward with the then Lord Ravenswood to the fatal battle of Flodden, in which they both fell. Thus hard pressed, the master offered to ride forward to get matters put in such preparation as time and circumstances admitted. But the Marquis protested his kinsman must afford him his company, and would only consent that an avant courier should carry to the designated seneschal, Caleb Balderstone, the unexpected news of this invasion. The master of Ravenswood soon after accompanied the Marquis in his carriage, as the latter had proposed, and when they became better acquainted in the progress of the journey, his noble relation explained the very liberal views which he entertained for his relation's preferment, in case of the success of his own political schemes. They related to a secret and highly important commission beyond sea, which could only be entrusted to a person of rank, talent, and perfect confidence, and which, as it required great trust and reliance on the envoy employed, could but not prove both honorable and advantageous to him. We need not enter into the nature and purpose of this commission, farther than to acquaint our readers that the charge was in prospect highly acceptable to the Master of Ravenswood, who hailed with pleasure the hope of emerging from his present state of indigence and inaction into independence and honorable exertion. While he listened thus eagerly to the details with which the Marquis now thought it necessary to entrust him, the messenger who had been dispatched to the tower of Wolf's Crag returned with Caleb Balderstone's humble duty and an assurance that a should be in seemly order, sick as the hurry of time permitted, to receive their lordships as it behoved. Ravenswood was too well accustomed to his seneschal's mode of acting and speaking to hope much from this confident assurance. He knew that Caleb acted upon the principle of the Spanish generals and the campaign of who, much to the perplexity of the Prince of Orange, their commander-in-chief, used to report their troops as full in number and possessed of all necessary points of equipment, not considering it consistent with their dignity or the honor of Spain, to confess any deficiency either in men or munition, until the want of both was unavoidably discovered in the day of battle. Accordingly, Ravenswood thought it necessary to give the Marquis some hint that the fair assurance which they had just received from Caleb did not by any means ensure them against a very indifferent reception. "You do yourself injustice, master," said the Marquis, "or you wish to surprise me agreeably. From this window I see a great light in the direction where, if I remember aright, Wolf's Crag lies, and, to judge from the splendor which the old tower sheds around it, the preparations for our reception must be of no ordinary description. I remember your father putting the same deception on me. When we went to the tower for a few days hawking, about 20 years since, and yet we spent our time as jolly at Wolf's Crag as we could have done at my own hunting seat at BB. Your lordship, I fear, will experience that the faculty of the present proprietor to entertain his friends is greatly abridged," said Ravenswood. "The will, I need hardly say, remains the same, but I am as much at a loss as your lordship to account for so strong and brilliant a light as is now above Wolf's Crag. The windows of the tower are few and narrow, and those of the lower story are hidden from us by the walls of the court. I cannot conceive that any illumination of an ordinary nature could afford such a blaze of light." Illustration: the mystery was soon explained, for the cavalcade almost instantly halted, and the voice of Caleb Balderstone was heard at the coach window, exclaiming in accents broken by grief and fear, "Och, gentlemen, och, my goody lords, och haud to the right! Wolf's Crag is burning, bower and haghud the rich plenishing outside and inside the fine graith, pictures, tapestries, needlework, hangings, and other decorments in a bleeze, as if they were nae mair than sae mony peats, or as muckle peas stray. How to the right, gentlemen, I implore ye. There is some sma provision making at lucky sma trashes, but oh wae for this night, and wae for me that lives to see it." Ravenswood was first stunned by this new and unexpected calamity, but after a moment's recollection he sprang from the carriage, and hastily bidding his noble kinsman good night, was about to ascend the hill towards the castle, the broad and full conflagration of which now flung forth a high column of red light that flickered far to seaward upon the dashing waves of the ocean. "Take a horse, master," exclaimed the Marquis, greatly affected by this additional misfortune so unexpectedly heaped upon his young protege, "and give me my ambling palfrey, and haste forward, you knaves, to see what can be done to save the furniture, or to extinguish the fire ride, you knaves, for your lives." The attendants bustled together and began to strike their horses with the spur and call upon Caleb to show them the road. But the voice of that careful seneschal was heard above the tumult. "Oh, stop, sirs, stop, turn bridle, for the Louvre of mercy, add not loss of lives to the loss of world's gian." 30 barrels of powder, landed out of a Dunkirk dogger in the old lord's time and the vaults of the old tower. The fire canna be far off it, I trow. Lord's sake, to the right, lads, to the right. Let's pit the hill atween us and peril, a wap why a corner stain a Wolf's Crag wad defy the doctor. It will readily be supposed that this annunciation hurried the Marquis and his attendants into the route which Caleb prescribed, dragging Ravenswood along with them, although there was much in the matter which he could not possibly comprehend. "Gunpowder!" he exclaimed, laying hold of Caleb, who in vain endeavored to escape from him. "What gunpowder? How any quantity of powder could be in Wolf's Crag without my knowledge I cannot possibly comprehend." "But I can," interrupted the Marquis, whispering him, "I can comprehend it thoroughly. For God's sake ask him no more questions at present." "There it is, now," said Caleb, extricating himself from his master and adjusting his dress. "Your honor will believe his lordship's honorable testimony." His lordship minds weel how, in the year that him they ca'd King Willie died. Hush, hush, my good friend, said the Marquis. I shall satisfy your master upon that subject. And the people at Wolf's Hope, said Ravenswood, did none of them come to your assistance before the flame got so high? Did they, mony any of them, the rapscallions, said Caleb. But truly I was in nae hurry to let them into the tower, where there were so much plate and valuables. Confound you for an impudent liar, said Ravenswood in uncontrollable ire. There was not a single ounce of forby, said the butler, most irreverently raising his voice to a pitch which drowned his master's. The fire made fast on us, owing to the store of tapestry and carved timber in the banqueting hay, and the loons ran like scalded rats, sowing as they heard of the gunpowder. I do entreat, said the Marquis to Ravenswood, you will ask him no more. Questions. Only one, my lord. What has become of poor Mysie? Mysie, said Caleb. I had nae time to look about ony Mysie. She's in the tower, I's warrant, biding her awful doom. By heaven, said Ravenswood, I do not understand all this. The life of a faithful old creature is at stake. My lord, I will be withheld no longer. I will at least ride up and see whether the danger is as imminent as this old fool pretends. Weel then, as I live by bread, said Caleb, Mysie is weel and safe. I saw her out of the castle before I left it mysel. Was I ganging to forget an old fellow servant? What made you tell me the contrary this moment? Said his master. Did I tell you the contrary? Said Caleb. Then I maun have been dreaming, surely. Or this awesome night has turned my judgment, but safe she is, and ne'er a living soul in the castle, of the better for them. They wall have gotten an uncoheasy. The master of Ravenswood, upon this assurance being solemnly reiterated, and notwithstanding his extreme wish to witness the last explosion which was to ruin to the ground the mansion of his fathers, suffered himself to be dragged onward towards the village of Wolf's Hope, where not only the change house, but that of our well-known friend the cooper, were all prepared for reception of himself and his noble guest, with a liberality of provision which requires some explanation. We omitted to mention in its place that Lockhart, having fished out the truth concerning the mode by which Caleb had obtained the supplies for his banquet, the Lord Keeper, amused with the incident and desirous at the time to gratify Ravenswood, had recommended the cooper of Wolf's Hope to the official situation under government, the prospect of which had reconciled him to the loss of his wild fowl. Mr. Girder's preferment had occasioned a pleasing surprise to old Caleb, for when, some days after his master's departure, he found himself absolutely compelled, by some necessary business, to visit the fishing hamlet, and was gliding like a ghost past the door of the cooper, for fear of being summoned to give some account of the progress of the solicitation in his favor, or, more probably, that the inmates might upbraid him with the false hope he had held out upon the subject, he heard him. He beheard me might coiters. Caleb, Mr. Caleb Balderstone, I hope you are reena ganging dry-lipped by our door, and we say muckle indebted to you. This might be said ironically as well as in earnest. Caleb augured the worst, turned a deaf ear to the trio aforesaid, and was moving doggedly on, his ancient castor pulled over his brows, and his eyes bent on the ground, as if to count the flinty pebbles with which the rude pathway was causewayed. But on a sudden he found himself surrounded in his progress, like a stately merchantman in the gut of Gibraltar. I hope the ladies will excuse the tarpaulin phrase by 3 Algerine galleys. "Good guide us, Mr. Balderstone," said Mrs. Girder. "What he thought it of an old and kenned friend," said the mother. "And no sae muckle as stay to receive our thanks," said the cooper himself. "And frae the like o' me that seldom offers them. I am sure I hope there's nae ill seed sown between us, Mr. Balderstone. Ony man that has said to ye, I am no greffy for the situation of Queen's cooper, let me a lumple at him wample at him why mine eachy, that's a." "My good friends, my dear friends," said Caleb, still doubting how the certainty of the matter might stand, "what needs this ceremony? Anne tries to serve their friends, and sometimes they may happen to prosper, and sometimes to misky. Neaving, I care to be fashed why less than thinks, I never could bide them." "Faith, Mr. Balderstone, ye sold hae been fashed with few o' mine," said the downright man of staves and hoops. "If I had only your goody will to thank ye for, I sold e'en hae set the gews, and the wild dukes, and the runlet of sack to balance that account. Good will, man, is a geysened tub that hodes in nae liquor, but good deeds like the cask, tight, round, and sound, that will haud liquor for the king. Have ye no heard of our letter," said the mother-in-law, "making our John Gibbie the Queen's cooper for certain?" And scarce a chield that had ever hammered girt upon tub, but was applying for it. "Have I heard?" said Caleb, who now found how the wind set, with an accent of exceeding contempt, at the doubt expressed. "Have I heard, quo' she?" And as he spoke, he changed his shambling, skulking, dodging pace into a manly and authoritative step, readjusted his cocked hat, and suffered his brow to emerge from under it in all the pride of aristocracy, like the sun from behind a cloud. "To be sure he canna, but hae heard," said the good woman. "Aye, to be sure it's impossible but I should," said Caleb, "and sae I'll be the first to kiss ye, Joe, and wish you, cooer, much joy of your preferment. Naething doubting but ye ken whar are your friends, and have helped ye, and can help ye, and can help ye." "I thought it right to look a wee strange upon it at first," added Caleb, "just to see if ye were made of the right metal, but ye ring true, lad, ye ring true." So saying, with a most lordly air, he kissed the women and abandoned his hand, with an air of serene patronage, to the hearty shake of Mr. Gorder's horn, hard. Palm. Plots 4. Upon this complete, and to Caleb most satisfactory, information he did not, it may readily be believed, hesitate to accept an invitation to a solemn feast, to which were invited not only all the notables of the village, but even his ancient antagonist, Mr. Dingwall himself. At this festivity he was, of course, the most welcome and most honored guest, and so well did he ply the company with stories of what he could do with his master with the Lord Keeper with the council, and the council with the king, when to council with the king, that before the company dismissed, which was, indeed, rather at an early hour than a late one, every man of note in the village was ascending to the top gallant of some ideal preferment by the ladder of ropes which Caleb had presented to their imagination. Nay, the cunning butler regained in that moment not only all the influence he possessed formerly over the villagers, when the baronial family which he served were at the proudest, but acquired even an accession of importance. The writer the very attorney himself, such is the thirst of preferment, felt the force of the attraction, and taking an opportunity to draw Caleb into a corner, spoke, with affectionate regret, of the declining health of the sheriff clerk of the county. "An excellent man, a most valuable man, Mr. Caleb, but fat sly say, we are puir feckless bodies, here the day and awa by cock screech the morn, and if he failies, there maun be somebody in his place, and gif that you could edit my way, I s'll be thankful, man, a glue stuffed wi' jowled nobles, and hark ye, man, something canny till yoursel, and the Wolf's Hope Carls to settle kindly wi' the Master of Ravenswood, that is, Lord Ravenswood, that is, Lord Ravenswood, that is, Lord Ravenswood." A smile, and a hearty squeeze by the hand, was the suitable answer to this overture, and Caleb made his escape from the jovial party in order to avoid committing himself by any special promises. "The Lord be gude to me," said Caleb, when he found himself in the open air, and at liberty to give vent to the self-exultation with which he was, as it were, distended. "Did ever ony man see sic a set of green gaslings? The very pickmaws and solan geese out by yonder at the Bass hae 10 times their sense. God, and I had been the Lord High Commissioner to the Estates of Parliament, They couldna be flummed me mair, and, to speak heaven's truth, I could hardly he be flummed them better neither. But the writer, ha, 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 mercy on me that I sold live in my old days to jie the gannig bite of the very writer, sheriff clerk. But I he an old account to settle with a carle, and to make amends for bygains, the offer shall just cost him as much time serving and tide serving as if he were to get it in good earnest. Of whilk there is small appearance, unless the master learns mair the ways of this world, whilk it is muckle to be doubted that he never will do. Chapter 26. The circumstances announced in the conclusion of the last chapter will account for the ready and cheerful reception of the Marquis of A. and the Master of Ravenswood in the village of Wolf's Hope. In fact, Caleb had no sooner announced the conflagration of the tower than the whole hamlet were upon foot to hasten to extinguish the flames. And although that zealous adherent diverted their zeal by intimating the formidable contents of the subterranean apartments, yet the check only turned their assiduity into another direction. Never had there been such slaughtering of capons and fat geese and barn-door fowls. Never such boiling of reested hams. Never such making of car-cakes and sweet scones, Salkirk bannocks, cookies, and petticoat tails, delicacies little known to the present generation. Never had there been such a tapping of barrels and such uncorking of greybeards in the village of Wolf's Hope. All the inferior houses were thrown open for the reception of the Marquis's dependents, who came, it was thought, as precursors of the shower of preferment which hereafter was to leave the rest of Scotland dry, in order to distill its rich dews on the village of Wolf's Hope under Lammermoor. The minister put in his claim to have the guests of distinction lodged at the manse, having his eye, it was thought, upon a neighbouring preferment, where the incumbent was sickly. But Mr. Balderstone destined that honour to the cooper, his wife, and wife's mother, who danced for joy at the preferences thus assigned them. Many a beck and many a bow welcomed these noble guests to as good entertainment as persons of such rank could set before such visitors, and the old dame, who had formerly lived in Ravenswood Castle, and knew, as she said, the ways of the nobility, was in no whit wanting in arranging matters, as well as circumstances permitted, according to the etiquette of the times. The cooper's house was so roomy that each guest had his separate retiring room, to which they were ushered with all due ceremony, while the plentiful supper was in the act of being placed upon the table. Ravenswood no sooner found himself alone than, impelled by 1,000 feelings, he left the apartment, the house, and the village, and hastily retraced his steps to the brow of the hill, which rose betwixt the village and screened it from the tower, in order to view the final fall of the house of his fathers. Some idle boys from the hamlet had taken the same direction out of curiosity, having first witnessed the arrival of the coach and six and its attendants. As they ran one by one past the master, calling to each other to come and see the old tower blow up in the lift like the pealings of an engine, he could not but feel himself moved with indignation. "And these are the sons of my father's vassals," he said, "of men bound, both by law and gratitude, to follow our steps through battle and fire and flood, and now the destruction of their liege lord's house is but a holiday's sight to them." These exasperating reflections were partly expressed in the acrimony with which he exclaimed, on feeling himself pulled by the cloak, "What do you want?" "You dog?" "I am a dog, and an old dog too," answered Caleb, for was he who had taken the freedom, "and I am like to get a dog's wages, but it does not signification, a pinch of sneezing, for I am or a niger a dog to learn new tricks, or to follow a new master." As he spoke, Ravenswood attained the ridge of the hill from which Wolf's Crag was visible. The flames had entirely sunk down, and, to his great surprise, there was only a dusky reddening upon the clouds immediately over the castle, which seemed the reflection of the embers of the sunken fire. "The place cannot have blown up," said the master. We must have heard the report. If a quarter of the gunpowder was there you tell me of, it would have been heard 20 miles off. It very like it wad, said Balderstone composedly. Then the fire cannot have reached the vaults? It's like no, answered Caleb with the same impenetrable gravity. Harkee, Caleb, said his master, this grows a little too much for my patience. I must go and examine how matters stand at Wolf's Crag myself. Your honor is ganging to Gangnacisgate, said Caleb firmly. And why not? Said Ravenswood sharply. Who or what shall prevent me? Even I myself, said Caleb with the same determination. You, Balderstone, replied the master, you are forgetting yourself, I think. But I think no, said Balderstone, for I can just tell ye about the Castellan. This know-ahead as weel as if you were at it. Only dinna pit yoursel into a kippage and expose yoursel before the weans or before the Marquis when you gang down by. Speak out, you old fool, replied his master, and let me know the best and the worst at once. Ow, the best and the worst is just that the tower is standing hale and fair, as safe and as empty as when ye left it. Indeed, and the fire? Said Ravenswood. Not a gleed of fire then, except the bit kindling peat, and maybe a spunk in Mysie's cuddy pipe, replied Caleb. But the flame? Demanded Ravenswood. The broad blaze which might have been seen 10 miles off would occasion that. How to wa? It's an auld saying, and a true little's belight will be seen far in a mirk night. Effel seasons. And having that shorn that's a preet mun, and coseness pun at the send or bring ony body here, that them G gentles allen early, without ony from servants like that shield Lockhard, to be gledging and gleeing about, and looking upon the wrang side of Anne's housekeeping, to the discredit of the family, and forcing an ouse with a bead, to dem their souls while, telling a no, I'd rather set fire to the tower, and burn it, and outward with rid Upon my word, I am infinitely obliged by the proposal, Caleb, said his master, scarce able to restrain his laughter, though rather angry at the same time. But the gunpowder, is there such a thing in the tower? The Marquis seemed to know of it. The puther, ha, ha, ha. The Marquis, ha, 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 replied Caleb. If your honor were to brain me, I behooved to laugh. The Marquis the puther. Was it there? Aye, it was there. Did he ken o't? My certie, the Marquis kenned o't, and it was the best of the game. For when I could no pacify your honor with that I could say, I threw out a word mair about the gunpowder, and garred the Marquis tak the job in his ain't hand. But you have not answered my question, said the master impatiently. How came the powder there, and where is it now? Oh, it came there, and you maw needs ken, said Caleb, looking mysteriously and whispering, when there was like to be a wee bit rising here, and the Marquis and the great lords of the north were in it, and mony a goodly gun and broadsword were ferried our Frau Dunkirk for by the puther. All the work. We had gotten them into the tower under cloud o' night, for you maun think it wasn't a everybody could be trusted, why sis kittle jobs. But if you will gae hame to your supper, I will tell you about it as ye gang down. And these wretched boys, said Ravenswood, is it your pleasure they are to sit there all night to wait for the blowing up of a tower that is not even on fire? Surely not, if it is your honor's pleasure that they sull gang hame. Although, added Caleb, it wanda do them a grain's damage. They wad scray less the next day, and sleek the sounder at a yen. But just as your honor likes. Stepping accordingly towards the urchins who manned the knolls near which they stood, Caleb informed them, in an authoritative tone, that their honors, Lord Ravenswood and the Marquis of A had given orders that the tower was not to be blow up till next day at noon. The boys dispersed upon this comfortable assurance. One or two, however, followed Caleb for more information, particularly the urchin whom he had cheated while officiating as turnspit, who screamed, "Mr. Balderstone! Mr. Balderstone!" Then the castle's gane out like an old wife's spunk. "To be sure it is, callant," said the butler. "Do ye think the castle of as great a lord as Lord Ravenswood wad continue in a bleeze, and him standing looking on wi' shay, very e'en?" "It's aye right," continued Caleb, shaking off his ragged page and closing in to his master, "to train up weans, as the wise man says, in the way they should go, and a boon to teach them respect to their superiors. But all this while, Caleb, you have never told me what became of the arms and powder," said Ravenswood. "Why, as for the arms," said Caleb, "it was just like the Baron's rhyme. Some gied east, and some gaed west, and some gied west, and some gaed to the craw's nest. And for the puther, I e'en changed it, as occasion served, with the skippers of Dutch luggers and French vessels, for gin and brandy, and is served the house money a year, a good swat too, between what cheereth the soul of man, and that which hangeth it clean out of his body. Forby, I keep it a wheen pounds of it for your sell when you wanted to take the pleasure o' shooting, whiles, in these latter days, I would hardly hae kenned elsewhere to get puther. And now that your anger is ours, sir, wasn't to that weel managed o' me, an arena ye far better sorted down yonder than you could have been in your ancient old ruins up by yonder, as the case stands wi' us now. The mare's the pity. I believe you may be right, Caleb, but before burning down my castle, either in jest or in earnest," said Ravenswood, "I think I had a right to be in the secret." "Fie for shame, your honour," replied Caleb. "It fits an old carle like me weel in not to tell lees for the credit of the family, but it wanda beseem the like your honour's sell. Besides, young folk are no judicious, they cannot make the maist of a bit figment. Now this fire for a fire it shall be, if I shall burn the old stable to make it mair feasible this fire. Besides that it will be an excuse for asking onything we want through the country, or doon at the haven this fire will settle mony things on an honourable footing for the family's credit. That cost me telling 20 daily lees to a wheen idle chaps and queens, and, what's were, without gaining credence. That was hard indeed, Caleb, but I do not see how this fire should help your veracity or your credit." "There it is now," said Caleb. "Was I saying that young folk had a green judgment? How suld it help me, quotha? It will be a creditable apology for the honour of the family for this score of years to come, if it is weel guided. Where's the family pictures, says a meddling body. The great fire at Wolf's Crag. Answers I. Where's the family plate, says another. The great fire, says I. Why was to think of plate, when life and limb were in danger? Where's the wardrobe and the linens? Where's the tapestries and the decrements? Beds of state, twilts, pans and testers, napery and broidered work? The fire, the fire. Guide the fire wheel, and it will serve ye for a that ye sold have and have not, and in some sort a good excuse is better than the things themselves, for they maun crack and wear out and be consumed by time, whereas a good offcome, prudently and creditably handled, may serve a nobleman and his family, Lord kens how lang. Ravenswood was too well acquainted with his butler's pertinacity and self-opinion to dispute the point with him any farther. Leaving Caleb, therefore, to the enjoyment of his own successful ingenuity, he returned to the hamlet, where he found the Marquis and the good women of the mansion under some anxiety, the former on account of his absence, the others for the discredit their cookery might sustain by the delay of the supper. All were now at ease, and heard with pleasure that the fire at the castle had burned out of itself without reaching the vaults, which was the only information that Ravenswood thought it proper to give in public concerning the event of his butler's stratagem. They sat down to an excellent supper. No invitation could prevail on Mr. and Mrs. Girder, even in their own house, to sit down at table with guests of such high quality. They remained standing in the apartment, and acted the part of respectful and careful attendants on the company. Such were the manners of the time. The elder dame, confident through her age and connection with the Ravenswood family, was less scrupulously ceremonious. She played a mixed part betwixt that of the hostess of an inn and the mistress of a private house who receives guests above her own degree. She recommended and even pressed what she thought best, and was herself easily entreated to take a moderate share of the good cheer in order to encourage her guests by her own example. Often she interrupted herself to express her regret that my lord did not eat, that the master was piking a bare bane, that to be sure there was nathing there fit to set before their honours, that Lord Allen, rest his soul, used to like a powthered Gus, and said it was Latin for a tassel brandy, that the brandy came frae France direct, for the English laws and gogers, the Wolf's Hope Briggs handa forgotten the gate to Dunkirk. Here the cooper admonished his mother-in-law with his elbow, which procured him the following special notice in the progress of her speech. "Ye needna be dunching that gate, John," continued the old lady. "Naebody says that ye ken whar the brandy comes frae, and it wanda be fitting ye should, and you the Queen's cooper. And what signifies on't?" continued she, addressing Lord Ravenswood, "to king or Kaiser wine, wat her art mould wife my bizer pickle sneeshin, or her drap brandy wine, to hard herd?" Having thus extricated herself from her supposed false step, Dame Loup the Dyke proceeded, during the rest of the evening, to supply, with great animation and very little assistance from her guests, the funds necessary for the support of the conversation, until, declining any further circulation of their glass, her guests requested her permission to retire to their apartments. The Marquis occupied the chamber of dais, which, in every house above the rank of a mere cottage, was kept sacred for such high occasions as the present. The modern finishing with plaster was then unknown, and tapestry was confined to the houses of the nobility and superior gentry. The cooper, therefore, who was a man of some vanity as well as some wealth, had imitated the fashion observed by the inferior landholders and clergy, who usually ornamented their state apartments with hangings of a sort of stamped leather, manufactured in the Netherlands, garnished with trees and animals, executed in copper foil, and with many a pithy sentence of morality, which, although couched in Low Dutch, were perhaps as much attended to in practice as written in broad Scotch. The whole had somewhat of a gloomy aspect, but the fire, composed of old pitch-barrel staves, blazed merrily up the chimney. The bed was decorated with linen of most fresh and dazzling whiteness, which had never before been used, and might perhaps have never been used at all, but for this high occasion. On the toiletette beside stood an old-fashioned mirror in a filigree frame, part of the dispersed finery of the neighboring castle. It was flanked by a long-necked bottle of Florence wine, by which stood a glass nearly as tall, resembling in shape that which Teniers usually places in the hands of his own portrait when he paints himself as mingling in the revels of a country village. To counterbalance those foreign sentinels, there mounted guard on the other side of the mirror two stout warders of Scottish lineage, a jug, namely, of double ale, which held a Scotch pint, and a quay, or bicker of ivory and ebony, hooped with silver, the work of John Girder's own hands and the pride of his heart. Besides these preparations against thirst, there was a goodly diet loaf, or sweet cake, so that with such auxiliaries, the apartment seemed victualled against a siege of 2 or 3 days. It only remains to say that the Marquis's valet was in attendance, displaying his master's brocaded nightgown and richly embroidered velvet cap, lined and faced with Brussels lace, upon a huge leathern easy-chair, wheeled round so as to have the full advantage of the comfortable fire which we have already mentioned. We therefore commit that eminent person to his night's repose, trusting he profited by the ample preparations made for his accommodation, preparations which we have mentioned in detail as illustrative of ancient Scottish manners. It is not necessary we should be equally minute in describing the sleeping apartment of the Master of Ravenswood, which was that usually occupied by the goodman and goodwife themselves. It was comfortably hung with a sort of warm-coloured worsted manufactured in Scotland, approaching in texture to what is now called challoon, a staring picture of John Gibbie Garter himself. ornamented this dormitory, painted by a starving Frenchman who had, God knows how or why, strolled over from Flushing or Dunkirk to Wolfshope in a smuggling dogger. The features were indeed those of the stubborn, opinionative, yet sensible artisan, but Monsieur had contrived to throw a French grace into the look and manner so utterly inconsistent with the dogged gravity of the original that it was impossible to look at it without laughing. John and his family, however, piqued themselves not a little upon this picture, and were proportionably censured by the neighborhood, who pronounced that the cooper, in sitting for the same, and yet more in presuming to hang it up in his bedchamber, had exceeded his privilege as the richest man of the village, at once stepped beyond the bounds of his own rank, and encroached upon those of the superior orders, and, in fine, had been guilty of a very overweening act of vanity and presumption. Respect for the memory of my deceased friend, Mr. Richard Tinto, has obliged me to treat this matter at some length, but I spare the reader his prolix though curious observations, as well upon the character of the French school as upon the state of painting in Scotland at the beginning of the 18th century. The other preparations of the master's sleeping apartment were similar to those in the chamber of Dace. At the usual early hour of that period, the Marquess of A and his kinsman prepared to resume their journey. This could not be done without an ample breakfast, in which cold meat and hot meat, and oatmeal, flummery, wine and spirits, and milk varied by every possible mode of preparation, evinced the same desire to do honor to their guests, which had been shown by the hospitable owners of the mansion upon the evening before. All the bustle of preparation for departure now resounded through Wolfshope. There was paying of bills, and shaking of hands, and saddling of horses, and harnessing of carriages, and distributing of drink money. The Marquis left a broad piece for the gratification of John Girder's household, which he, the said John, was for some time disposed to convert to his own use, Dingwall, the writer, assuring him he was justified in so doing, seeing he was the disburser of those expenses which were the occasion of the gratification. But, notwithstanding this legal authority, John could not find in his heart to dim the splendor of his late hospitality by picketing anything in the nature of a gratuity. He only assured his menials he would consider them as a damn ungrateful pack if they bought a gill of brandy elsewhere than out of his own stores. And as the drink money was likely to go to its legitimate use, he comforted himself that, in this manner, the Marquis's donative would, without any impeachment of credit and character, come ultimately into his own exclusive possession. While arrangements were making for departure, Ravenswood made blithe the heart of his ancient butler by informing him, cautiously however, for he knew Caleb's warmth of imagination, of the probable change which was about to take place in his fortunes. He deposited with Balderstone at the same time the greater part of his slender funds, with an assurance which he was obliged to reiterate more than once that he himself had sufficient supplies in certain prospect. He therefore enjoined Caleb, as he valued his favor, to desist from all farther manoeuvres against the inhabitants of Wolfshope, their cellars, poultry yards, and substance whatsoever. In this prohibition, the old domestic acquiesced more readily than his master expected. It was doubtless, he said, a shame, a discredit, and a sin to harry the pecuniary creatures when the family were in circumstances to live honorably on their means, and there might be wisdom, he added, in giving them a while's breathing time at any rate, that they might be the more readily brought forward upon his honor's future occasions. This matter being settled, and having taken an affectionate farewell of his old domestic, the master rejoined his noble relative, who was now ready to enter his carriage. The two landladies, old and young, having received in all kindly greeting a kiss from each of their noble guests, stood simpering at the door of their house as the coach and six, followed by its train of clattering horsemen, thundered out of the village. John Girder also stood upon his threshold, now looking at his honored right hand, which had been so lately shaken by a marquis and a lord, and now giving a glance into the interior of his mansion, which manifested all the disarray of the late revel, as if balancing the distinction which he had attained with the expenses of the entertainment. At length he opened his oracular jaws. Let every man and woman here set about their ain't business, as if there was nae sic thing as marquis or master, duke or drake, laird or lord in this world. Let the house be redd up, the broken meat set by, and if there is onything totally uneatable, let it be gin to the pure folk. And, good mother and wife, I hae just a thing to entreat ye, that you will never speak to me a single word, good or bad, and then at this nonsense work, but keep a your cracks about it to your selves and your kimmers, for my head is weel nigh done our way it already. As John's authority was tolerably absolute, all departed to their usual occupations, leaving him to build castles in the air, if he had a mind, upon the court favor which he had acquired by the expenditure of his worldly substance. Chapter 27. Our travelers reach Edinburgh without any farther adventure, and the Master of Ravenswood, as had been previously settled, took up his abode with his noble friend. In the meantime, the political crisis which had been expected took place, and the Tory party obtained in the Scottish, as in the English, councils of Queen Anne a short-lived ascendancy, of which it is not our business to trace either the cause or consequences. Suffice it to say that it affected the different political parties according to the nature of their principles. In England, many of the High Church party, with Harley, afterwards Earl of Oxford, at their head, affected to separate their principles from those of the Jacobites, and, on that account, obtained the denomination of whimsicals. The Scottish High Church party, on the contrary, or, as they termed themselves, the Cavaliers, were more consistent, if not so prudent, in their politics, and viewed all the changes now made as preparatory to calling to the throne, upon the Queen's demise, her brother the Chevalier de Saint George. Those who had suffered in his service now entertained the most unreasonable hopes, not only of indemnification, but of vengeance upon their political adversaries, while families attached to the Whig interest saw nothing before them but a renewal of the hardships they had undergone during the reigns of Charles II and his brother, and a retaliation of the confiscation which had been inflicted upon the Jacobites during that of King William. But the most alarmed at the change of system was that prudential set of persons, some of whom are found in all governments, but who abound in a provincial administration like that of Scotland during the period, and who are what Cromwell called waiters upon Providence, or, in other words, uniform adherents to the party who are uppermost. Many of these hastened to read their recantation to the Marquis of A, and, as it was easily seen that he took a deep interest in the affairs of his kinsman, the Master of Ravenswood, they were the first to suggest measures for retrieving at least a part of his property, and for restoring him in blood against his father's attainder. Old Lord Turntippet professed to be one of the most anxious for the success of these measures, for it grieved him to the very soul, he said, to see so brave a young gentleman of sick old and undoubted nobility, and what was mair than a tête-hit, a blue-eyed relation of the Marquis of A, the man whom, he swore, he honoured most upon the face of the earth, brought to so severe a pass, for his ain pure peculiar, as he said, and to contribute something to the rehabilitation of say Aldenhouse, the said Turntippet sent in 3 family pictures lacking the frames, and 6 high-backed chairs, with work turkey cushions, having the crest of Ravenswood broidered thereon, without charging a penny either of the principal or interest they had cost him, when he bought them, 16 years before, at a roop of the furniture of Lord Ravenswood's lodgings in the Canongate. Much more to Lord Turntippet's dismay than to his surprise, although he affected to feel more of the latter than the former, the Marquis received his gift very dryly, and observed that his lordship's restitution, if he expected it to be received by the Master of Ravenswood and his friends, must comprehend a pretty large farm, which, having been mortgaged to Turntippet for a very inadequate sum, he had contrived, during the confusion of the family affairs, and by means well understood by the lawyers of that period, to corrige cultural candos sandis pocormuti the old-time serving lord winced excessively under the requisition, protesting to God that he saw no occasion the lad could have for the instant possession of the land, seeing he would doubtless now recover the bulk of his estate from Sir William Ashton, to which he was ready to contribute by every means in his power, as was just and reasonable, and finally declaring that he was willing to settle the land on the young gentleman after his own natural demise. But all these excuses availed nothing, and he was compelled to disgorge the property on receiving back the sum for which it had been mortgaged. Having no other means of making peace with the higher powers, he returned home sorrowful and malcontent, complaining to his confidants that every mutation or change in the state had hitherto been productive of some small advantage to him in his ain't quiet affairs, but that the present had pies upon it, cost him one of the best pin feathers of his wing. Similar measures were threatened against others who had profited by the wreck of the fortune of Ravenswood, and Sir William Ashton in particular was menaced with an appeal to the House of Peers, a court of equity, against the judicial sentences proceeding upon a strict and severe construction of the letter of the law, under which he held the castle and barony of Ravenswood. With him, however, the master, as well for Lucy's sake as on account of the hospitality he had received from him, felt himself under the necessity of proceeding with great candor. He wrote to the late Lord Keeper, for he no longer held that office, stating frankly the engagement which existed between him and Miss Ashton, requesting his permission for their union, and assuring him of his willingness to put the settlement of all matters between them upon such a footing as Sir William himself should think favorable. The same messenger was charged with a letter to Lady Ashton, deprecating any cause of displeasure which the master might unintentionally have given her, enlarging upon his attachment to Miss Ashton and the length to which it had proceeded, and conjuring the lady, as a Douglas in nature as well as in name, generously to forget ancient prejudices and misunderstandings, and to believe that the family had acquired a friend, and she herself a respectful and attached humble servant, in him who subscribed himself Edgar Mies at a betraying in it contained the strongest protestations of continued affection, and dwelt upon the approaching change of the writer's fortunes as chiefly valuable by tending to remove the impediments to their union. He related the steps he had taken to overcome the prejudices of her parents, and especially of her mother, and expressed his hope they might prove effectual. If not, he still trusted that his absence from Scotland upon an important and honourable mission might give time for prejudices to die away, while he hoped and trusted Miss Ashton's constancy, on which he had the most implicit reliance, would baffle any effort that might be used to divert her attachment. Much more there was, which, however interesting to the lovers themselves, would afford the reader neither interest nor information. To each of these 3 letters the master of Ravenswood received an answer, but by different means of conveyance, and certainly couched in very different styles. Lady Ashton answered his letter by his own messenger, who was not allowed to remain at Ravenswood a moment longer than she was engaged in penning these lines. For the hand of Mr. Ravenswood of Wolf's Crag, these, Sire Uninier, I have received a letter, signed Edgar, Master of Ravenswood, concerning the writer, whereof I am uncertain, seeing that the honours of such a family were forfeited for high treason in the person of Alan, late Lord Ravenswood. Sir, if you shall happen to be the person so subscribing yourself, you will please to know that I claim the full interest of a parent in Miss Lucy Ashton, which I have disposed of irrevocably in behalf of a worthy person. And, sir, were this otherwise, I would not listen to a proposal from you or any of your house, seeing their hand has been uniformly held up against the freedom of the subject and the immunities of God's kirk. Sir, it is not a flittering blink of prosperity which can change my constant opinion in this regard, seeing it has been my lot before now, like holy David, to see the wicked great in power and flourishing like a green bay tree. Nevertheless I passed, and they were not, and the place thereof knew them no more. Wishing you to lay these things to your heart for your own sake so far as they may concern you, I pray you to take no farther notice of her who desires to remain your unknown servant, Margaret Douglas, otherwise Ashton. About 2 days after he had received this very unsatisfactory epistle, the Master of Ravenswood, while walking up the High Street of Edinburgh, was jostled by a person in whom, as the man pulled off his hat to make an apology, he recognized Lockhart, the confidential domestic of Sir William Ashton. The man bowed, slipped a letter into his hand, and disappeared. The packet contained 4 close-written folios, from which, however, as is sometimes incident to the compositions of great lawyers, little could be extracted, excepting that the writer felt himself in a very puzzling predicament. Sir William spoke at length, at regard for his dear young friend, the Master of Ravenswood, and of regard for the Marquis of A., his very dear old friend. He trusted that any measures that they might adopt, in which he was concerned, would be carried on with due regard to the sanctity of decrees and judgments obtained in foro contentioso, protesting before men and angels that if the law of Scotland, as declared in her supreme courts, were to undergo a reborquil challenge, he flourished much on generosity and forgiveness of mutual injuries, and hinted at the mutability of human affairs, always favorite topics with the weaker party in politics. He pathetically lamented and gently censured the haste which had been used in depriving him of his situation of Lord Keeper, which his experience had enabled him to fill with some advantage to the public, without so much as giving him an opportunity of explaining how far his own views of general politics might essentially differ from those now in power. He was convinced the Marquis of A. had as sincere intentions towards the public as himself or any man, and if, upon a conference, they could have agreed upon the measures by which it was to be pursued, his experience and his interest should have gone to support the present administration. Upon the engagement betwixt Ravenswood and his daughter, he spoke in a dry and confused manner. He regretted so premature a step as the engagement of the young people should have been taken, and conjured the master to remember he had never given any encouragement thereunto, and observed that, as a transaction inter minors, and without concurrence of his daughter's natural curators, the engagement was inept, and void in law. This precipitate measure, he added, had produced a very bad effect upon Lady Ashton's mind, which it was impossible at present to remove. Her son, Colonel Douglas Ashton, had embraced her prejudices in the fullest extent, and it was impossible for Sir William to adopt a course disagreeable to them without a fatal and irreconcilable breach in his family, which was not at present to be thought of. Time, the great physician, he hoped, would mend all. In a postscript, Sir William said something more explicitly, which seemed to intimate that, rather than the law of Scotland should sustain a severe wound through his sides, by a reversal of the judgment of her supreme courts, in the case of the barony of Ravenswood, through the intervention of what, with all submission, he must term a foreign court of appeal, he himself would extrajudically consent to considerable sacrifices. From Lucy Ashton, by some unknown conveyance, the master received the following lines: "I receive yours, but it was at the utmost risk. Do not attempt to write again. Till better times. I am sore beset, but I will be true to my word while the exercise of my reason is vouchsafed to me. That you are happy and prosperous is some consolation, and my situation requires it all." The note was signed L.A. This letter filled Ravenswood with the most lively alarm. He made many attempts, notwithstanding her prohibition, to convey letters to Miss Ashton, and even to obtain an interview, but his plans were frustrated, and he had only the mortification to learn that anxious and effectual precautions had been taken to prevent the possibility of their correspondence. The master was the more distressed by these circumstances, as it became impossible to delay his departure from Scotland upon the important mission which had been confided to him. Before his departure he put Sir William Ashton's letter into the hands of the Marquis of A., who observed with a smile that Sir William's day of grace was past, and that he had now to learn which side of the hedge the sun had got to. It was with the greatest difficulty that Ravenswood extorted from the Marquis a promise that he would compromise the proceedings in Parliament, providing Sir William should be disposed to acquiesce in a union between him and Lucy Ashton. "I would hardly," said the Marquis, "consent to your throwing away your birthright in this manner, were I not perfectly confident that Lady Ashton, or Lady Douglas, or whatever she calls herself, will, as Scotchmen say, keep her threep, and that her husband dares not contradict her." "But yet," said the master, "I trust your lordship will consider my engagement as sacred." "Believe my word of honor," said the Marquis, "I would be a friend even to your follies, and having thus told you my opinion, I will endeavor, as occasion offers, to serve you according to your own." The Master of Ravenswood could but thank his generous kinsman and patron, and leave him full power to act in all his affairs. He departed from Scotland upon his mission, which it was supposed might detain him upon the continent for some months. Chapter 28. 12 months had passed away since the Master of Ravenswood's departure for the continent, and, although his return to Scotland had been expected in a much shorter space, yet the affairs of his mission, or, according to a prevailing report, others of a nature personal to himself, still detained him abroad. In the meantime, the altered state of affairs in Sir William Ashton's family may be gathered from the following conversation, which took place betwixt Bucklaw and his confidential bottle companion and dependent, the noted Captain Cregingelt. They were seated on either side of the huge sepulchral-looking freestone chimney in the low hall at Garrington. A wood fire blazed merrily in the grate. A round oaken table placed between them supported a stoup of excellent claret, 2 rummer glasses and other good cheer, and yet, with all these appliances and means to boot, the countenance of the patron was dubious, doubtful, and unsatisfied, while the invention of his dependent was taxed to the utmost to parry what he most dreaded, a fit, as he called it, of the sullens on the part of his protector. After a long pause, only interrupted by the devil's tattoo, which Bucklaw kept beating against the hearth with the toe of his boot, Cregingelt at last ventured to break silence. "May I be double distanced," said he, "if ever I saw a man in my life have less the air of a bridegroom. Cut me out of feather if you have not more the look of a man condemned to be hanged." "My kind thanks for the compliment," replied Bucklaw, "but I suppose you think upon the predicament in which you yourself are most likely to be placed. And pray, Captain Cregingelt, if it please your worship, why should I look merry when I'm sad, and devilish sad too?" "And that's what vexes me," said Cregingelt. "Here is this match, the best in the whole country, and which you were so anxious about, is on the point of being concluded, and you are as sulky as a bear that has lost its whelps." "I do not know," answered the laird doggedly, "whether I should conclude or not, if it was not that I am too far forwards to leap back." "Leap back!" exclaimed Cregingelt, with a well-assumed air of astonishment. "That would be playing the back game with a witness. Leap back! Why, is not the girl's fortune the young lady's, if you please?" said Haston, interrupting him. Well, no disrespect meant. Will Miss Ashton's tocher not weigh against any in Lothian?" "Granted," answered Bucklaw, "but I care not a penny for her tocher. I have enough of my own." "And the mother, that loves you like her own child?" "Better than some of her children, I believe," said Bucklaw, "or there would be little love weared on the matter. And Colonel Sholto Douglas Ashton, who desires the marriage above all earthly things?" "Because," said Bucklaw, "he expects to carry the county of through my interest, and the father, who is as keen to see the match concluded as ever I have been to win a main." "Aye," said Bucklaw in the same disparaging manner, "it lies with Sir William's policy to secure the next best match, since he cannot barter his child to save the great Ravenswood estate, which the English House of Lords are about to wrench out of his clutches." "What say you to the young lady herself?" said Craigengelt. "The finest young woman in all Scotland, one that you used to be so fond of when she was cross, and now she consents to have you, and gives up her engagement with Ravenswood. You are for jibbing. I must say, the devil's in ye, when ye neither know what you would have nor what you would want." "I'll tell you my meaning in a word," answered Bucklaw, getting up and walking through the room. "I want to know what the devil is the cause of Miss Ashton's changing her mind so suddenly." "And what need you care?" said Craigengelt, "since the change is in your favor." "I'll tell you what it is," returned his patron. "I never knew much of that sort of fine ladies, and I believe they may be as capricious as the devil. But there is something in Miss Ashton's change, a devilish deal too sudden and too serious for a mere flisk of her own. I'll be bound, Lady Ashton understands every machine for breaking in the human mind, and there are as many as there are cannon bit, martingales, and cabeçons for young colts." "And if that were not the case," said Craigengelt, "how the devil should we ever get them into training at all?" "And that's true, too," said Bucklaw, suspending his march to the dining-room, and leaning upon the back of a chair. "And besides, here's Ravenswood in the way still. Do you think he'll give up Lucy's engagement?" "To be sure he will," answered Craigengelt. "What good can it do him to refuse, since he wishes to marry another woman and she another man?" "And you believe seriously," said Bucklaw, "that he is going to marry the foreign lady we heard of?" "You heard yourself," answered Craigengelt, "what Captain Westenho said about it, and the great preparation made for their blithesome bridal." "Captain Westenho," replied Bucklaw, "has rather too much of your own cast about, Craigie, to make what Sir William would call a famous witness. He drinks deep, plays deep, swears deep, and I suspect can lie and cheat a little into the bargain. Useful qualities, Craigie, if kept in their proper sphere, but which have a little too much of the freebooter to make a figure in a court of evidence." "Well then," said Craigengelt, "will you believe Colonel Douglas Ashton, who heard the Marquis of A say in a public circle, but not aware that he was within earshot, that his kinsman had made a better arrangement for himself than to give his father's land for the pale-cheeked daughter of a broken-down fanatic, and that Bucklaw was welcome to the wearing of Ravenswood's shalt shoes?" "Did he say so, by heavens?" cried Bucklaw, breaking out into one of those incontrollable fits of passion to which he was constitutionally subject. "If I had heard him, I would have torn the tongue out of his throat before all his peats and minions, and Highland bullies into the bargain. Why did not Ashton run him through the body?" "Capo me if I know," said the captain. "He deserved it sure enough. But he is an old man and a minister of state, and there would be more risk than credit in meddling with him. You had more need to think of making up to Miss Lucy Ashton the disgrace that's like to fall upon her than of interfering with a man too old to fight and on too high a tool for your hand to reach him." "It shall reach him, though, one day," said Bucklaw, "and his kinsman Ravenswood to boot. In the meantime, I'll take care Miss Ashton receives no discredit for the slight they have put upon her. It's an awkward job, however, and I wish it were ended. I scarce know how to talk to her. But fill a bumper, Craigie, and we'll drink her health. It grows late, and a night cowl of good claret is worth all the considering caps in Europe." Chapter 29. It was the copy of our conference. "In bed she slept not, for my urging it. At board she fed not, for my urging it. Alone, it was the subject of my theme. In company, I often glanced at it. Comedy of horrors." The next morning saw Bucklaw and his faithful Ashades, Craigengelt, at Ravenswood Castle. They were most courteously received by the knight and his lady, as well as by their son and heir, Colonel Ashton. After a good deal of stammering and blushing, for Bucklaw, notwithstanding his audacity in other matters, had all the sheepish bashfulness common to those who have lived little in respectable society, he contrived at length to explain his wish to be admitted to a conference with Miss Ashton upon the subject of their approaching union. Sir William and his son looked at Lady Ashton, who replied with the greatest composure that Lucy would wait upon Mr. Haston directly. I hope, she added with a smile, that as Lucy is very young and has been lately trepanned into an engagement of which she is now heartily ashamed, our dear Bucklaw will excuse her wish that I should be present at their interview. In truth, my dear lady, said Bucklaw, it is the very thing that I would have desired on my own account, for I have been so little accustomed to what is called gallantry that I shall certainly fall into some cursed mistake unless I have the advantage of your ladyship as an interpreter. It was thus that Bucklaw, in the perturbation of his embarrassment upon this critical occasion, forgot the just apprehensions he had entertained of Lady Ashton's overbearing ascendancy over her daughter's mind, and lost an opportunity of ascertaining, by his own investigation, the real state of Lucy's feelings. The other gentlemen left the room, and in a short time Lady Ashton followed by her daughter, entered the apartment. She appeared, as he had seen her on former occasions, rather composed than agitated, but a nicer judge than he could scarce have determined whether her calmness was that of despair or of indifference. Bucklaw was too much agitated by his own feelings minutely to scrutinize those of the lady. He stammered out an unconnected address, confounding together the 2 or 3 topics to which it related, and stopped short before he brought it to any regular conclusion. Miss Ashton listened, or looked as if she listened, but returned not a single word in answer, continuing to fix her eyes on a small piece of embroidery, on which, as if by instinct or habit, her fingers were busily employed. Lady Ashton sat at some distance, almost screened from notice by the deep embrasure of the window in which she had placed her chair. From this she whispered, in a tone of voice which, though soft and sweet, had something in it of admonition, if not command. Lucy, my dear, remember, have you heard what Bucklaw has been saying? The idea of her mother's presence seemed to have slipped from the unhappy girl's recollection. She started, dropped her needle, and repeated hastily, and almost in the same breath, the contradictory answers. Yes, madam, no, my lady, I beg pardon, I did not hear. You need not blush, my love, and still less need you look so pale and frightened, said Lady Ashton, coming forward. We know that maidens' ears must be slow in receiving a gentleman's language, but you must remember Mr. Haston speaks on the subject on which you have long since agreed to give him a favorable hearing. You know how much your father and I have our hearts set upon an event so extremely desirable. In Lady Ashton's voice, a tone of impressive and even stern innuendo was sedulously and skilfully concealed under an appearance of the most affectionate maternal tenderness. The manner was for Bucklaw, who was easily enough imposed upon. The matter of the exhortation was for the terrified Lucy, who well knew how to interpret her mother's hints, however skilfully their real purport might be veiled from general observation. Miss Ashton sat upright in her chair, cast round her a glance in which fear was mingled with a still wilder expression, but remained perfectly silent. Bucklaw, who had in the meantime paced the room to and fro until he had recovered his composure, now stopped within 2 or 3 yards of her chair, and broke out as follows. I believe I have been a d-fool, Miss Ashton. I have tried to speak to you as people tell me young ladies like to be talked to, and I don't think you comprehend what I have been saying, and no wonder, for did I understand it myself. But however, once for all, and in broad Scotch, your father and mother like what is proposed, and if you can take a plain young fellow for your husband, who will never cross you in anything you have a mind to, I will place you at the head of the best establishment in the 3 Lothians. You shall have Lady Garrington's lodging in the Canongate of Edinburgh, Go where you please, do what you please, and see what you please, and that's fair. Only I must have a corner at the board end for a worthless old playfellow of mine, whose company I would rather want than have, if it were not that the D fellow has persuaded me that I can't do without him, and so I hope you won't accept against Craigie, although it might be easy to find much better company. Now out upon you, Bucklaw, said Lady Ashton, again interposing. How can you think Lucy can have any objection to that blunt, honest, good-natured creature, Captain Craigengelt? Why, madam, replied Bucklaw, as to Craigie's sincerity, honesty, and good nature, they are, I believe, pretty much upon a par, but that's neither here nor there. The fellow knows my ways, and has got useful to me, and I cannot well do without him, as I said before. But all this is nothing to the purpose, for since I have mustered up courage to make a plain proposal, I would fain hear Miss Ashton, from her own lips, give me a plain answer. My dear Bucklaw, said Lady Ashton, let me spare Lucy's bashfulness. I tell you, in her presence, that she has already consented to be guided by her father and me in this matter. Lucy, my love, she added with that singular combination of suavity of tone and pointed energy which we have already noticed. Lucy, my dearest love, speak for yourself, is it not as I say? Her victim answered in a tremulous and hollow voice, I have promised to obey you, but upon one condition. She means, said Lady Ashton, turning to Bucklaw, she expects an answer to the demand which she has made upon the man at Vienna, or Ratisbon, or Paris, or where is he? For restitution of the engagement in which he had the art to involve her. You will not, I am sure, my dear friend, think it is wrong that she should feel much delicacy upon this head. Indeed, it concerns us all. Perfectly right, quite fair, said Bucklaw, half humming, half speaking, the end of the old song, it is best to be off wi the old love, before you be on wi the new. But I thought, said he, pausing, you might have had an answer 6 times told from Ravenswood. D—n me, if I have not a mind to go fetch one myself, if Miss Ashton will honour me with the commission. By no means, said Lady Ashton. We have had the utmost difficulty of preventing Douglas, for whom it would be more proper, from taking so rash a step. And do you think we could permit you, my good friend, almost equally dear to us, to go to a desperate man upon an errand so desperate? In fact, all the friends of the family are of opinion, and my dear Lucy herself ought so to think, that, as this unworthy person has returned no answer to her letter, silence must on this, as in other cases, be held to give consent, and a contract must be supposed to be given up when the party waives insisting upon it. Sir William, who should know best, is clear upon this subject, and therefore, my dear Lucy, madam, said Lucy with unwonted energy, urge me no farther. If this unhappy engagement be restored, I have already said you shall dispose of me as you will. Till then I should commit a heavy sin in the sight of God and man in doing what you require. But, my love, if this man remains obstinately silent, he will not be silent, answered Lucy. It is 6 weeks since I sent him a double of my former letter by a sure hand. You have not, you could not, you durst not, said Lady Ashton with violence, inconsistent with the tone she had intended to assume, but instantly correcting herself. My dearest Lucy, said she in her sweetest tone of expostulation, how could you think of such a thing? No matter, said Bucklaw. I respect Miss Ashton for her sentiments, and I only wish I had been her messenger myself. And pray how long, Miss Ashton, said her mother, ironically, are we to wait the return of your Pacolet, your fairy messenger, since our humble couriers of flesh and blood could not be trusted in this matter? I have numbered weeks, days, hours, and minutes, said Miss Ashton. Within another week I shall have an answer, unless he is dead. Till that time, sir, she said, addressing Bucklaw, let me be thus far beholden to you, that you will beg my mother to forbear me upon this subject. I will make it my particular entreaty to Lady Ashton, said Bucklaw. By my honor, madam, I respect your feelings, and although the prosecution of this affair be rendered dearer to me than ever, yet as I am a gentleman I would renounce it, were it so urged as to give you a moment's pain. Mr. or Haston, I think, cannot comprehend that, said Lady Ashton, looking pale with anger, when the daughter's happiness lies in the bosom of the mother. Let me ask you, Miss Ashton, in what terms your last letter was couched? Exactly in the same, madam, answered Lucy, which you dictated on a former occasion, when 8 days have elapsed. Then, said her mother, resuming her tone of tenderness, we shall hope, my dearest love, that you will end this suspense. Miss Ashton must not be hurried, madam, said Bucklaw, whose bluntness of feeling did not by any means arise from want of good nature. Messengers may be stopped or delayed. I have known a day's journey broke by the casting of a foreshoe. Stay, let me see my calendar. The 20th day from this is St. Jude's, and the day before I must be at Caverton Edge to see the match between the Laird of Kittlegirth's black mare and Johnston the mealmonger's 4-year-old colt, but I can ride all night, or Craigie can bring me word how the match goes. And I hope, in the meantime, as I shall not myself distress Miss Ashton with any further importunity, that your ladyship yourself and Sir William and Colonel Douglas to Tim you dental. Sir, said Miss Ashton, you're generous. As for that, madam, answered Bucklaw, I only pretend to be a plain, good-humoured young fellow, as I said before, who will willingly make you happy if you will permit him, and show him how to do so. Having said this, he saluted her with more emotion than was consistent with his usual train of feeling, and took his leave. Lady Ashton, as she accompanied him out of the apartment, assuring him that her daughter did full justice to the sincerity of his attachment, and requesting him to see Sir William before his departure, since, as she said, with a keen glance reverting towards Lucy, against St. Jude's day, we must all be ready to sign and seal. To sign and seal, echoed Lucy in a muttering tone as the door of the apartment closed. To sign and seal, to do and die. And, clasping her extenuated hands together, she sunk back on the easy-chair she occupied, in a state resembling stupor. From this, she was shortly after awakened by the boisterous entry of her brother Henry, who clamorously reminded her of a promise to give him 2 yards of carnation ribbon to make knots to his new garters. With the most patient composure Lucy arose, and opening a little ivory cabinet, sought out the ribbon the lad wanted, measured it accurately, cut it off into proper lengths, and knotted it into the fashion his boyish whim required. "Dinna shut the cabinet yet," said Henry, "for I must have some of your silver wire to fasten the bells to my hawk's jesses, and yet the new falcon's not worth them neither. For do you know, after all the plague we had to get her from an eyrie, all the way at Paso in Manor water, she's going to prove, after all, nothing better than a rifler. She just wets her singles in the blood of the partridge, and then breaks away and lets her fly. And what good can the poor bird do after that? You know, it's considered right, Henry, right, very right, said Luch mournfully, holding the boy fast by the hand, after she had given him the wire he wanted. But there are more riflers in the world than your falcon, and more wounded birds that seek but to die in quiet, that can find neither brake nor windbush to hide their head in. Ah, that's some speech out of your romances, said the boy, and Sholto says they have turned your head. But I hear Norman whistling to the hawk. I must go fasten on the jesses. And he scabbered away with the thoughtless gaiety of boyhood, leaving his sister to the bitterness of her own reflections. "It is decreed," she said, "that every living creature, even those who owe me most kindness, are to shun me, and leave me to those by whom I am beset. It is just it should be thus. Alone and uncounselled, I involved myself in these perils. Alone and uncounselled, I must extricate myself or die." Chapter 30. as some vindication of the ease with which Bucklaw, who otherwise, as he termed himself, was really a very good-humored fellow, resigned his judgment to the management of Lady Ashton, while paying his addresses to her daughter, the reader must call to mind the strict domestic discipline which, at this period, was exercised over the females of a Scottish family. The manners of the country in this, as in many other respects, coincided with those of France before the Revolution. Young women of the higher rank seldom mingled in society until after marriage, and, both in law and fact, were held to be under the strict tutelage of their parents, who were too apt to enforce the views for their settlement in life, without paying any regard to the inclination of the parties chiefly interested. On such occasions the suitor expected little more from his bride than a silent acquiescence in the will of her parents, and as few opportunities of acquaintance, far less of intimacy, occurred, he made his choice by the outside, as the lovers and the merchant of Venice select the casket. Contented to trust to chance the issue of the lottery in which he had hazarded a venture. It was not therefore surprising, such being the general manners of the age, that Mr. Haston of Bucklaw, whom dissipated habits had detached in some degree from the best society, should not attend particularly to those feelings in his elected bride to which many men of more sentiment, experience, and reflection would, in all probability, have been equally indifferent. He knew what all accounted the principal point, that her parents and friends, namely, were decidedly in his favor, and that there existed most powerful reasons for their predilection. In truth, the conduct of the Marquis of A, since Ravenswood's departure, had been such as almost to bar the possibility of his kinsman's union with Lucy Ashton. The Marquis was Ravenswood's sincere but misjudging friend, or rather, like many friends and patrons, he consulted what he considered to be his relation's true interest, although he knew that in doing so he ran counter to his inclinations. The Marquis drove on, therefore, with the plenitude of ministerial authority, and appealed to the British House of Peers against those judgments of the courts of law by which Sir William became possessed of Ravenswood's hereditary property. As this measure, enforced with all the authority of power, was new in Scottish judicial proceedings, though now so frequently resorted to, it was exclaimed against by the lawyers on the opposite side of politics as an interference with the civil judicature of the country, equally new, arbitrary, and tyrannical. And if it thus affected even strangers connected with them only by political party, it may be guessed what the Ashton family themselves said and thought under so gross a dispensation. Sir William, still more worldly minded than he was timid, was reduced to despair by the loss by which he was threatened. His son's haughtier spirit was exalted into rage at the idea of being deprived of his expected patrimony. But to Lady Ashton's yet more vindictive temper, the conduct of Ravenswood, or rather of his patron, appeared to be an offence challenging the deepest and most immortal revenge. Even the quiet and confiding temper of Lucy herself, swayed by the opinions expressed by all around her, could not but consider the conduct of Ravenswood as precipitate and even unkind. "It was my father," she repeated with a sigh, "who welcomed him to this place, and encouraged, or at least allowed, the intimacy between us. Should he not have remembered this, and requited it with at least some moderate degree of procrastination in the assertion of his own alleged rights, I would have forfeited for him double the value of these lands, which he pursues with an ardor that shows he has forgotten how much I am implicated in the matter." Lucy, however, could only murmur these things to herself, unwilling to increase the prejudices against her lover entertained by all around her, who exclaimed against the steps pursued on his account as illegal, vexatious, and tyrannical, resembling the worst measures in the worst times of the worst stewards, and a degradation of Scotland, the decisions of whose learned judges were thus subjected to the review of a court composed indeed of men of the highest rank, and who were not trained to the study of any municipal law, and might be supposed specially to hold in contempt that of Scotland. As a natural consequence of the alleged injustice meditated towards her father, Every means was restored to, and every argument urged to induce Miss Ashton to break off her engagement with Ravenswood as being scandalous, shameful, formed with the mortal enemy of her family, and calculated to add bitterness to the distress of her parents. Lucy's spirit, however, was high, and although unaided and alone, she could have borne much. She could have endured the repinings of her father, his murmurs against what he called the tyrannical usage of the ruling party, his ceaseless charges of ingratitude against Ravenswood, his endless lectures on the various means by which contracts may be voided and annulled, his quotations from the civil, municipal, and the canon law, and his prelections upon the patria potestas. She might have borne also in patience, or repelled with scorn, the bitter taunts and occasional violence of her brother, Colonel Douglas Ashton, and the impertinent and intrusive interference of other friends and relations. But it was beyond her power effectually to withstand or elude the constant and unceasing persecution of Lady Ashton, who, laying every other wish aside, had bent the whole efforts of her powerful mind to break her daughter's contract with Ravenswood, and to place a perpetual bar between the lovers by effecting Lucy's union with Bucklaw. Far more deeply skilled than her husband in the recesses of the human heart, she was aware that in this way she might strike a blow of deep and decisive vengeance upon one whom she esteemed as her mortal enemy, nor did she hesitate at raising her arm, although she knew that the wound must be dealt to the bosom of her daughter. With this stern and fixed purpose, she sounded every deep and shallow of her daughter's soul, assumed alternately every disguise of manner which could serve her object, and prepared at leisure every species of dire machinery by which the human mind can be wrenched from its settled determination. Some of these were of an obvious description, and require only to be cursorily mentioned. Others were characteristic of the time, the country, and the persons engaged in this singular drama. It was of the last consequence that all intercourse betwixt the lovers should be stopped, and, by dint of gold and authority, Lady Ashton contrived to possess herself of such a complete command of all who were placed around her daughter that, if fact, no leaguered fortress was ever more completely blockaded, while, at the same time, to all outward appearance Miss Ashton lay under no restriction. The verge of her parents' domains became, in respect to her, like the viewless ancient Antru, enchanted line drawn around a fairy castle, where nothing unpermitted can either enter from without or escape from within. Thus every letter in which Ravenswood conveyed to Lucy Ashton the indispensable reasons which detained him abroad, and more than one note which poor Lucy had addressed to him through what she thought a secure channel, fell into the hands of her mother. It could not be but that the tenor of these intercepted letters, especially those of Ravenswood, should contain something to irritate the passions and fortify the obstinacy of her into whose hands they fell. But Lady Ashton's passions were too deep-rooted to require this fresh food. She burnt the papers as regularly as she perused them, and as they consumed into vapor and tinder, regarded them with a smile upon her compressed lips and an exultation in her steady eye, which showed her confidence that the hopes of the writers should soon be rendered equally unsubstantial. It usually happens that fortune aids the machinations of those who are prompt to avail themselves of every chance that offers. A report was wafted from the Continent, founded, like others of the same sort, upon many plausible circumstances, but without any real basis, stating the Master of Ravenswood to be on the eve of marriage with a foreign lady of fortune and distinction. This was greedily caught up by both the political parties, who were at once struggling for power and for popular favor, and who seized as usual upon the most private circumstances in the lives of each other's partisans to convert them into subjects of political discussion. The Marquis of A gave his opinion aloud and publicly, not indeed in the coarse terms ascribed to him by Captain Craigengelt, but in a manner sufficiently offensive to the Ashtons. He thought the report, he said, highly probable, and heartily wished it might be true. such a match was fitter and far more creditable for a spirited young fellow than a marriage with the daughter of an old Whig lawyer whose chicanery had so nearly ruined his father. The other party, of course, laying out of view the opposition which the Master of Ravenswood received from Miss Ashton's family, cried shame upon his fickleness and perfidy, as if he had seduced the young lady into an engagement, and wilfully and causelessly abandoned her for another. Sufficient care was taken that this report should find its way to Ravenswood Castle, through every various channel, Lady Ashton being well aware that the very reiteration of the same rumour from so many quarters could not but give it a semblance of truth. By some it was told as a piece of ordinary news, by some communicated as serious intelligence. Now it was whispered to Lucy Ashton's ear in the tone of malignant pleasantry, and now transmitted to her as a matter of grave and serious warning. Even the boy Henry was made the instrument of adding to his sister's torments. One morning he rushed into the room with a willow branch in his hand, which, he told her, had arrived that instant from Germany for her special wearing. Lucy, as we have seen, was remarkably fond of her younger brother, and at that moment his wanton and thoughtless unkindness seemed more keenly injurious than even the studied insults of her elder brother. Her grief, however, had no shade of resentment. She folded her arms about the boy's neck, and saying faintly, "Poor Henry, you speak but what they tell you," she burst into a flood of unrestrained tears. The boy was moved, notwithstanding the thoughtlessness of his age and character. "The devil take me," said he. "Lucy, if I fetch you any more of these tormenting messages again, for I like you better," said he, kissing away the tears, "than the whole pack of them. And you shall have my grey pony to ride on, and you shall have my grey pony to ride on, and you shall canter him if you like. Aye, and ride beyond the village too, if you have a mind." "Who told you," said Lucy, "that I am not permitted to ride where I please?" "That's a secret," said the boy, "but you will find you can never ride beyond the village, but your horse will cast a shoe, or fall lame, or the cattle bell will ring, or something will happen to bring you back. But if I tell you more of these things, Douglas will not get me the pair of colours they have promised me, and so good morrow to you." This dialogue plunged Lucy in still deeper dejection, as it tended to show her plainly what she had for some time suspected, that she was little better than a prisoner at large in her father's house. We have described her in the outset of our story as of a romantic disposition, delighting in tales of love and wonder, and readily identifying herself with the situation of those legendary heroines with whose adventures, for want of better reading, her memory had become stocked. The fairy wand, with which in her solitude she had delighted to raise visions of enchantment, became now the rod of a magician, the bond-slave of evil genii, serving only to invoke spectres at which the exorcist trembled. She felt herself the object of suspicion, of scorn, of dislike at least, if not of hatred, to her own family, and it seemed to her that she was abandoned by the very person on whose account she was exposed to the enmity of all around her. Indeed, the evidence of Ravenswood's infidelity began to assume every day a more determined character. A soldier of fortune, of the name of Westenho, an old familiar of Craigengelt's, chanced to arrive from abroad about this time. The worthy captain, though without any precise communication with Lady Ashton, always acted most regularly and sedulously in support of her plans, and easily prevailed upon his friend, by dint of exaggeration of real circumstances and coming of others, to give explicit testimony to the truth of Ravenswood's approaching marriage. Thus beset on all hands, and in a manner reduced to despair, Lucy's temper gave way under the pressure of constant affliction and persecution. She became gloomy and abstracted, and, contrary to her natural and ordinary habit of mind, sometimes turned with spirit and even fierceness on those by whom she was long and closely annoyed. Her health also began to be shaken, and her hectic cheek and wandering eye gave symptoms of what is called a fever upon the spirits. In most mothers this would have moved compassion, but Lady Ashton, compact and firm of purpose, saw these waverings of health and intellect with no greater sympathy than that with which the hostile engineer regards the towers of a beleaguered city as they reel under the discharge of his artillery. Or rather, she considered these starts and inequalities of temper as symptoms of Lucy's expiring resolution, as the angler, by the throes and convulsive exertions of the fish which he has hooked, becomes the weekday, to accelerate the catastrophe in the present case, Lady Ashton had recourse to an expedient very consistent with the temper and credulity of those times, but which the reader will probably pronounce truly detestable and diabolical. Chapter 31. The help of Lucy Ashton soon required the assistance of a person more skilful in the office of a sick nurse than the female domestics of the family. Ailsie Gourlay, sometimes called the wise woman of Bowden, was the person whom, for her own strong reasons, Lady Ashton selected as an attendant upon her daughter. This woman had acquired a considerable reputation among the ignorant by the pretended cures which she performed, especially in oncomes, as the Scotch call them, or mysterious diseases which baffle the regular physician. Her pharmacopoeia consisted partly of herbs selected in planetary hours, partly of words, signs, and charms, which sometimes, perhaps, produced a favorable influence upon the imagination of her patients. Such was the avowed profession of Lucky Gourlay, which, as may well be supposed, was looked upon with a suspicious eye, not only by her neighbors, but even by the clergy of the district. In private, however, she traded more deeply in the occult sciences, for, notwithstanding the dreadful punishments inflicted upon the supposed crime of witchcraft, there wanted not those who, steeled by want and bitterness of spirit, were willing to adopt the hateful and dangerous character, for the sake of the influence which its terrors enabled them to exercise in the vicinity and the wretched emolument which they could extract by the practice of their supposed art. Ailsie Gourlay was not indeed fool enough to acknowledge a compact with the evil one, which would have been a swift and ready road to the stake and tar barrel. Her fairy, she said, like Caliban's, was a harmless fairy. Nevertheless, she sped fortunes, read dreams, composed philtres, discovered stolen goods, and made and dissolved matches as successfully as if, according to the belief of the whole neighborhood, she had been aided in those arts by Beelzebub himself. The worst of the pretenders to these sciences was that they were generally persons who, feeling themselves odious to humanity, were careless of what they did to deserve the public hatred. Real crimes were often committed under pretense of magical imposture, and it somewhat relieves the disgust with which we read, in the criminal records, the conviction of these wretches, to be aware that many of them merited, as poisoners, suborners, and diabolical agents in secret domestic crimes, the severe fate to which they were condemned for the imaginary guilt of witchcraft. Such was Ailsie Gourlay, whom, in order to attain the absolute subjugation of Lucy Ashton's mind, her mother thought it fitting to place near her person. A woman of less consequence than Lady Ashton had not dared to take such a step, but her high rank and strength of character set her above the censure of the world, and she was allowed to have selected for her daughter's attendant the best and most experienced sick nurse and mediciner in the neighborhood, where an inferior person would have fallen under the reproach of calling in the assistance of a partner and ally of the great enemy of mankind. The beldam caught her cue readily and by innuendo, without giving Lady Ashton the pain of distinct explanation. She was in many respects qualified for the part she played, which indeed could not be efficiently assumed without some knowledge of the human heart and passions. Dame Gourlay perceived that Lucy shuddered at her external appearance, which we have already described when we found her in the death chamber of blind Alice, and while internally she hated the poor girl for the involuntary horror with which she saw she was regarded, she commenced her operations by endeavoring to efface or overcome those prejudices which, in her heart, she resented as mortal offenses. This was easily done, for the hag's external ugliness was soon balanced by a show of kindness and interest to which Lucy had of late been little accustomed. Her attentive services and real skill gained her the ear, if not the confidence, of her patient, and under pretense of diverting the solitude of a sick room, she soon led her attention captive by the legends in which she was well skilled, and to which Lucy's habit of reading and reflection induced her to lend an attentive ear. Dame Gourlay's tales were at first of a mild and interesting character, of fays that nightly dance upon the wold, and lovers doomed to wander and to weep, and castles high where wicked wizards keep their captive thralls. Gradually, however, they assumed a darker and more mysterious character, and became such as, told by the midnight lamp and enforced by the tremulous tone, the quivering and livid lip, the uplifted skinny forefinger, and the shaking head of the blue-eyed hag, might have appalled a less credulous imagination in an age more hard of belief. The old Sycorax saw her advantage, and gradually narrowed her magic circle around the devoted victim on whose spirit she practiced. Her legends began to relate to the fortunes of the Ravenswood family, whose ancient grandeur and portentous authority credulity had graced with so many superstitious attributes. The story of the fatal fountain was narrated at full length, and with formidable additions by the ancient Sibyl. The prophecy, quoted by Caleb, concerning the dead bride who was to be won by the last of the Ravenswoods, had its own mysterious commentary, and the singular circumstance of the apparition seen by the Master of Ravenswood in the forest, having partly transpired through his hasty inquiries in the cottage of old Alice, formed a theme for many exaggerations. Lucy might have despised these tales if they had been related concerning another family, or if her own situation had been less despondent. But circumstanced as she was, the idea that an evil fate hung over her attachment became predominant over her other feelings, and the gloom of superstition darkened a mind already sufficiently weakened by sorrow, distress, uncertainty, and an oppressive sense of desertion and desolation. Stories were told by her attendant, so closely resembling her own in their circumstances that she was gradually led to converse upon such tragic and mystical subjects with the beldam, and to repose a sort of confidence in the Sibyl, whom she still regarded with involuntary shuddering. Dame Gourlay knew how to avail herself of this imperfect confidence. She directed Lucy's thoughts to the means of inquiring into futurity, the surest mode, perhaps, of shaking the understanding and destroying the spirits. Omens were expounded, dreams were interpreted, and other tricks of jugglery perhaps resorted to, by which the pretended adepts of the period deceived and fascinated their deluded followers. I find it mentioned in the articles of Distay against Ailsie Gourlay, for it is some comfort to know that the old hag was tried, condemned, and burned on the top of North Berwick Law by sentence of a commission from the Privy Council. I say, it was charged against her, among other offences, that she had by the aid and delusions of Satan shown to a young person of quality, in a mirror glass, a gentleman then abroad, to whom the said young person was betrothed, and who appeared in the attitude of be at bait, than he older thing he did about the bandit up but this and some other parts of the record appear to have been studiously left imperfect in names and dates, probably out of regard to the honor of the families concerned. If Dame Gourlay was able actually to play off such a piece of jugglery, it is clear she must have had better assistance to practice the deception than her own skill or funds could supply. Meanwhile, this mysterious visionary traffic had its usual effect in unsettling Miss Ashton's mind. Her temper became unequal, her health decayed daily, her manners grew moping, melancholy, and uncertain. Her father, guessing partly at the cause of these appearances, made a point of banishing Dame Gourlay from the castle. But the arrow was shot and was rankling barbed deep in the side of the wounded deer. It was shortly after the departure of this woman that Lucy Ashton, urged by her parents, announced to them, with a vivacity by which they were startled, that she was conscious heaven and earth and hell had set themselves against her union with Ravenswood. Still, her contract, she said, was a binding contract, and she neither would nor could resign it without the consent of Ravenswood. Let me be assured, she concluded, that he will free me from my engagement, and dispose of me as you please, I care not how. When the diamonds are gone, what signifies the casket? The tone of obstinacy with which this was said, her eyes flashing with unnatural light, and her hands firmly clenched, precluded the possibility of dispute, and the utmost length which Lady Ashton's art could attain only got her the privilege of dictating the letter by which her daughter required to know of Ravenswood whether he intended to abide by or to surrender what she termed their unfortunate engagement. Of this advantage Lady Ashton so far and so ingeniously availed herself that, according to the wording of the letter, the reader would have supposed Lucy was calling upon her lover to renounce a contract which was contrary to the interests and inclinations of both. Not trusting even to this point of deception, Lady Ashton finally determined to suppress the letter altogether, in hopes that Lucy's impatience would induce her to condemn Ravenswood unheard and in absence. In this she was disappointed. The time, indeed, had long elapsed when an answer should have been received from the Continent. The faint ray of hope which still glimmered in Lucy's mind was well nigh extinguished, but the idea never forsook her that her letter might not have been duly forwarded. One of her mother's new machinations unexpectedly furnished her with the means of ascertaining what she most desired to know. The female agents of hell having been dismissed from the castle, Lady Ashton, who wrought by all variety of means, resolved to employ for working the same end on Lucy's mind an agent of a very different character. This was no other than the Reverend Mr. Bide the Bent, a Presbyterian clergyman formerly mentioned, of the very strictest order and the most rigid orthodoxy, whose aid she called in, upon the principle of the tyrant in the tragedy. I'll have a priest shall preach her from her faith, and make it sin not to renounce that vow which I'd have broken. But Lady Ashton was mistaken in the agent she had selected. His prejudices, indeed, were easily enlisted on her side, and it was no difficult matter to make him regard with horror the prospect of a union betwixt the daughter of a God-fearing, professing, and Presbyterian family of distinction and the heir of a bloodthirsty prelatist and persecutor, the hands of whose fathers had been dyed to the wrists in the blood of God's saints. This resembled, in the divine's opinion, the union of a Moabitish stranger with a daughter of Zion. But with all the more severe prejudices and principles of his sect, Bide the Bent possessed a sound judgment, and had learned sympathy even in that very school of persecution where the heart is so frequently hardened. In a private interview with Miss Ashton, he was deeply moved by her distress, and could not but admit the justice of her request to be permitted a direct communication with Ravenswood upon the subject of their solemn contract. When she urged to him the great uncertainty under which she labored whether her letter had been ever forwarded, the old man paced the room with long steps, shook his grey head, rested repeatedly for a space on his ivory-headed staff, and, after much hesitation, confessed that he thought her doubts so reasonable that he would himself aid in the removal of them. "I cannot but opine, Miss Lucy," he said, "that your worshipful lady mother hath in this matter an eagerness whilk, although it ariseth doubtless from love to your best interests, here and hereafter, for the man is of persecuting blood, and himself a persecutor, a cavalier or malignant, and a scoffer, who hath no inheritance in Jesse. Nevertheless, we are commanded to do justice unto all, and to fulfill our bond and covenant, as well to the stranger as to him who is in brotherhood with us. Wherefore myself, even I myself, will be aiding unto the delivery of your letter to the man Edgar Ravenswood, trusting that the issue thereof may be your deliverance from the nets in which he hath sinfully engaged you, and that I may do in this neither more nor less than hath been warranted by your honorable parents. I pray you to transcribe, without increment or subtraction, the letter formerly expeded, under the dictation of your right honorable mother, and I shall put it into such sure course of being delivered, that if, honorable young madam, you shall receive no answer, it will be necessary that you conclude that the man meaneth in silence to abandon that naughty contract which, peradventure, he may be unwilling to restore. Lucy eagerly embraced the expedient of the worthy divine. A new letter was written in the precise terms of the former, and consigned by Mr. Bide the Bent to the charge of Saunders Moonshine, a zealous elder of the church when on shore, and when on board his brig as bold a smuggler as ever ran out a sliding bowsprit to the winds that blow betwixt Campbell and the east coast of Scotland. At the recommendation of his pastor, Saunders readily undertook that the letter should be securely conveyed to the Master of Ravenswood at the court where he now resided. This retrospect became necessary to explain the conference betwixt Miss Ashton, her mother, and Bucklaw, which we have detailed in a preceding chapter. Lucy was now like the sailor who, while drifting through a tempestuous ocean, clings for safety to a single plank, his powers of grasping it becoming every moment more feeble, and the deep darkness of the night only checkered by the flashes of lightning, hissing as they show the white tops of the billows, in which he is soon to be engulfed. Week crept away after week, and day after day. St. Jude's Day arrived, the last and protracted term to which Lucy had limited herself, and there was neither letter nor news of Ravenswood. Chapter 32. St. Jude's Day came, the term assigned by Lucy herself as the furthest date of expectation, and, as we have already said, there were neither letters from nor news of Ravenswood. But there were news of Bucklaw and of his trusty associate Craigengelt, who arrived early in the morning for the completion of the proposed espousals and for signing the necessary deeds. These had been carefully prepared under the revisal of Sir William Ashton himself, it having been resolved, on account of the state of Miss Ashton's health, as it was said, that none save the parties immediately interested should be present when the parchments were subscribed. It was further determined that the marriage should be solemnized upon the 4th day after signing the articles, a measure adopted by Lady Ashton, in order that Lucy might have as little time as possible to recede or relapse into intractability. There was no appearance, however, of her doing either. She heard the proposed arrangement with the calm indifference of despair, or rather with an apathy arising from the oppressed and stupefied state of her feelings. To an eye so unobserving as that of Bucklaw, her demeanor had little more of reluctance than might suit the character of a bashful young lady, who, however, he could not disguise from himself, was complying with the choice of her friends rather than exercising any personal predilection in his favor. When the morning compliment of the bridegroom had been paid, Miss Ashton was left for some time to herself, her mother remarking that the deeds must be signed before the hour of noon, in order that the marriage might be happy. Lucy suffered herself to be attired for the occasion as the taste of her attendants suggested, and was of course splendidly arrayed. Her dress was composed of white satin and Brussels lace, and her hair arranged with a profusion of jewels, whose luster made a strange contrast to the deadly paleness of her complexion and to the trouble which dwelt in her unsettled eye. Her toilette was hardly finished ere Henry appeared, to conduct the passive bride to the state apartment where all was prepared for signing the contract. "Do you know, sister," he said, "I am glad you are to have Bucklaw after all, instead of Ravenswood, who looked like a Spanish grandee come to cut our throats and trample our bodies underfoot. And I am glad the broad seas are between us this day, for I shall never forget how frightened I was when I took him for the picture of old Sir Malise walked out of the canvas. Tell me true, are you not glad to be fairly shot of him?" "Ask me no questions, dear Henry," said his unfortunate sister. "There is little more can happen to make me either glad or sorry in this world." "And that's what all young brides say," said Henry. "And so do not be cast down, Lucy, for you'll tell another tale, a 12-month hence, and I am to be bridesman and ride before you to the kirk, and all our kith, kin, and allies and all. Bucklaws are to be mounted and in order, and I am to have a scarlet-laced coat, and a feathered hat, and a sword belt, double bordered with gold and pointy Spain, and a dagger instead of a sword. And I should like a sword much better, but my father won't hear of it. All my things and 100 besides are to come out from Edinburgh tonight with old Gilbert and the Sumpter mules, and I will bring them and show them to you the instant they come. The boys' chatter was here interrupted by the arrival of Lady Ashton, somewhat alarmed at her daughter's stay. With one of her sweetest smiles, she took Lucy's arm under her own. There were only present Sir William Ashton and Colonel Douglas Ashton, the last in full regimentals, Bucklaw in bridegroom trim, Craigengelt freshly equipped from top to toe by the bounty of his patron and bedizened with as much lace as might have become the dress of the copper captain, together with the Reverend Mr. Bide the Bent, the presence of a minister being, in strict Presbyterian families, an indispensable requisite upon all occasions of unusual solemnity. Wines and refreshments were placed on a table on which the writings were displayed, ready for signature. But before proceeding either to business or refreshment, Mr. Bide the Bent, at a signal from Sir William Ashton, invited the company to join him in a short extemporary prayer, in which he implored a blessing upon the contract now to be solemnized between the honorable parties then present. With the simplicity of his times and profession, which permitted strong personal allusions, he petitioned that the wounded mind of one of these noble parties might be healed, in reward of her compliance with the advice of her right honorable parents, and that, as she had proved herself a child after God's commandment, by honoring her father and mother, she and hers might enjoy the promised blessing length of days in the land here, and the happy portion hereafter in a better country. He prayed farther that the bridegroom might be weaned from those follies which seduced youth from the path of knowledge, that he might cease to take delight in vain and unprofitable company, scoffers, rioters, and those who sit late at the wine. Here Bucklaw winked at Craigengelt, and ceased from the society that causes to err. A suitable supplication in behalf of Sir William and Lady Ashton and their family concluded this religious address, which thus embraced every individual present excepting Craigengelt, whom the worthy divine probably considered as past all hopes of grace. The business of the day now went forward. Sir William Ashton signed the contract with legal solemnity and precision, his son with military nonchalance, and Bucklaw, having subscribed as rapidly as Craigengelt could manage to turn the leaves, concluded by wiping his pen on that worthy's new laced cravat. It was now Miss Ashton's turn to sign the writings, and she was guided by her watchful mother to the table for that purpose. At her first attempt, she began to write with a dry pen, and when the circumstance was pointed out, seemed unable, after several attempts, to dip it in the massive silver ink standish which stood full before her. Lady Ashton's vigilance hastened to supply the deficiency. I have myself seen the fatal deed, and in the distinct characters in which the name of Lucy Ashton is traced, on each page there is only a very slight tremulous irregularity, indicative of her state of mind at the time of the subscription. But the last signature is incomplete, defaced, and blotted. For, while her hand was employed in tracing it, the hasty tramp of a horse was heard at the gate, succeeded by a step in the outer gallery, and a voice which, in the commanding tone, bore down the opposition of the menials. The pen dropped from Lucy's fingers as she exclaimed with a faint shriek, "He is come! He is come!" Chapter 33. Hardly had Miss Ashton dropped the pen when the door of the apartment flew open and the master of Ravenswood entered the apartment. Lockhart and another domestic, who had in vain attempted to oppose his passage through the gallery or antechamber, were seen standing on the threshold, transfixed with surprise, which was instantly communicated to the whole party in the stateroom. That of Colonel Douglas Ashton was mingled with resentment, that of Bucklaw with haughty and affected indifference. The rest, even Lady Ashton herself, showed signs of fear, and Lucy seemed stiffened to stone by this unexpected apparition. Apparition it might well be termed, for Ravenswood had more the appearance of one returned from the dead than of a living visitor. He planted himself full in the middle of the apartment, opposite to the table at which Lucy was seated, on whom, as if she had been alone in the chamber, he bent his eyes with the mingled expression of deep grief and deliberate indignation. His dark-colored riding cloak, displaced from one shoulder, hung around one side of his person in the ample folds of the Spanish mantle. The rest of his rich dress was travel-soiled and deranged by hard riding. He had a sword by his side and pistols in his belt. His slouched hat, which he had not removed at entrance, gave an additional gloom to his dark features which, wasted by sorrow and marked by the ghastly look communicated by long illness, added to a countenance naturally somewhat stern and wild, a fierce and even savage expression. The matted and disheveled locks of hair which escaped from under his hat, together with his fixed and unmoved posture, made his head more resemble that of a marble bust than that of a living man. He said not a single word, and there was a deep silence in the company for more than 2 minutes. It was broken by Lady Ashton, who in that space partly recovered her natural audacity. She demanded to know the cause of this unauthorized intrusion. "That is a question, madam," said her son, "which I have the best right to ask, and I must request of the Master of Ravenswood to follow me where he can answer it at leisure." Bucklaw interposed, saying, "No man on earth should usurp his previous right in demanding an explanation from the master. Craigengelt," he added in an undertone, "Dieu, why do you stand staring as if you saw a ghost? Fetch me my sword from the gallery." "I will relinquish to none," said Colonel Ashton, "my right of calling to account the man who has offered this unparalleled affront to my family." "Be patient, gentlemen," said Ravenswood, turning sternly towards them, and waving his hand as if to impose silence on their altercation. "If you are as weary of your lives as I am, I will find time and place to pledge mine against one or both. At present I have no leisure for the disputes of triflers." "Triflers," echoed Colonel Ashton, half unsheathing his sword, while Bucklaw laid his hand on the hilt of that which Craigengelt had just reached him. Sir William Ashton, alarmed for his son's safety, rushed between the young men and Ravenswood, exclaiming, "My son, I command you, Bucklaw, I entreat you keep the peace, in the name of the Queen and of the law." "In the name of the law of God," said Bide the Bent, advancing also with uplifted hands between Bucklaw, the colonel, and the object of their resentment. "In the name of him who brought peace on earth and goodwill to mankind, I implore, I beseech, I command you to forbear violence towards each other. God hateth the bloodthirsty man. He who striketh with the sword shall perish with the sword." "Do you take me for a dog, sir," said Colonel Ashton, turning fiercely upon him, "or something more brutally stupid, to endure this insult in my father's house? Let me go, Bucklaw. He shall account to me, or, by heavens, I will stab him where he stands." "You shall not touch him here," said Bucklaw. "He once gave me my life, and were he the devil come to fly away with the whole house and generation, he shall have nothing but fair play." The passions of the 2 young men thus counteracting each other gave Ravenswood leisure to exclaim, in a stern and steady voice, "Silence! Let him who really seeks danger take the fitting time when it is to be found. My mission here will be shortly accomplished. Is that your handwriting, madam?" he added in a softer tone, extending towards Miss Ashton her last letter. A faltering "yes" seemed rather to escape from her lips than to be uttered as a voluntary answer. And is this also your handwriting, extending towards her the mutual engagement? Lucy remained silent. Terror, and a yet stronger and more confused feeling so utterly disturbed her understanding that she probably scarcely comprehended the question that was put to her. "If you design," said Sir William Ashton, "to found any legal claim on that paper, sir, do not expect to receive any answer to an extrajudicial question." "Sir William Ashton," said Ravenswood, "I pray you, and all who hear me, that you will not mistake my purpose. If this young lady, of her own free will, desires the restoration of this contract, as her letter would seem to imply, there is not a withered leaf which this autumn wind strews on the heath that is more valueless in my eyes. But I must and will hear the truth from her own mouth. Without this satisfaction I will not leave this spot. Murder me by numbers you possibly may. But I am an armed man. I am a desperate man, and I will not die without ample vengeance. This is my resolution. Take it as you may. I will hear her determination from her own mouth. From her own mouth, alone and without witnesses, will I hear it. Now, choose," he said, drawing his sword with the right hand and, with the left, by the same motion taking a pistol from his belt and cocking it, but turning the point of one weapon and the muzzle of the other to the ground. "Choose if you will have this hall floated with blood, or if you will grant me the decisive interview with my affianced bride, which the laws of God and the country alike entitle me to demand." Illustration. All recoiled at the sound of his voice and the determined action by which it was accompanied, for the ecstasy of real desperation seldom fails to overpower the less energetic passions by which it may be opposed. The clergyman was the first to speak. "In the name of God," he said, "receive an overture of peace from the meanest of his servants. What this honorable person demands, albeit it is urged with over-violence, hath yet in it something of reason. Let him hear from Miss Lucy's own lips that she hath dutifully acceded to the will of her parents, and repenteth her of her covenant with him, and when he is assured of this, he will depart in peace unto his own dwelling, and cumber us no more." Alas! The workings of the ancient Adam are strong even in the regenerate. Surely we should have long suffering with those who, being yet in the gall of bitterness and bond of iniquity, are swept forward by the uncontrollable current of worldly passion. Let, then, the Master of Ravenswood have the interview on which he insisteth. It can but be as a passing pang to this honorable maiden, since her faith is now irrevocably pledged to the choice of her parents. Let it, I say, be this: it belongeth to my functions to entreat your honour's compliance with this headling overture." "Never," answered Lady Ashton, whose rage had now overcome her first surprise and terror, "never shall this man speak in private with my daughter, the affianced bride of another. Pass from this room who will, I remain here. I fear neither his violence nor his weapons, though some," she said, glancing the look towards Colonel Ashton, "who bear my name appear more moved by them." "For God's sake, madam," answered the worthy divine, "add not fuel to firebrands. The Master of Ravenswood cannot, I am sure, object to your presence, the young lady's state of health being considered, and your maternal duty. I myself will also tarry. Peradventure my gray hairs may turn away wrath." "You are welcome to do so, sir," said Ravenswood, "and Lady Ashton is also welcome to remain if she shall think proper, but let all others depart." "Ravenswood," said Colonel Ashton, crossing him as he went out, "you shall account for this ere long." "When you please," replied Ravenswood. "But I," said Bucklaw with a half-smile, "have a prior demand on your leisure, a claim of some standing." "Arrange it as you will," said Ravenswood. "Leave me but this day in peace, and I will have no dearer employment on earth tomorrow than to give you all the satisfaction you can desire." The other gentlemen left the apartment, but Sir William Ashton lingered. "Master of Ravenswood," he said, in a conciliating tone, "I think I have not deserved that you should make this scandal an outrage in my family. If you will sheathe your sword and retire with me into my study, I will prove to you, by the most satisfactory arguments, the inutility of your present irregular procedure. Tomorrow, sir, tomorrow, I will hear you at length, reiterated Ravenswood, interrupting him. This day hath its own sacred and indispensable business. He pointed to the door, and Sir William left the apartment. Ravenswood sheathed his sword, uncocked and returned his pistol to his belt, walked deliberately to the door of the apartment, which he bolted, returned, raised his hat from his forehead, and gazing upon Lucy with eyes in which an expression of sorrow overcame their late fierceness, spread his dishevelled locks back from his face and said, "Do you know me, Miss Ashton? I am still Edgar Ravenswood." She was silent, and he went on with increasing vehemence, "I am still that Edgar Ravenswood who, for your affection, renounced the dear ties by which injured honor bound him to seek vengeance. I am that Ravenswood who, for your sake, forgave, nay, clasped hands in friendship with, the oppressor and pillager of his house, the traducer and murderer of his father." "My daughter," answered Lady Ashton, interrupting him, "has no occasion to dispute the identity of your person. The venom of your present language is sufficient to remind her that she speaks with the mortal enemy of her father." "I pray you to be patient, madam," answered Ravenswood. "My answer must come from her own lips. Once more, Miss Lucy Ashton, I am that Ravenswood to whom you granted the solemn engagement which you now desire to retract and cancel." Lucy's bloodless lips could only falter out the words, "It was my mother." "She speaks truly," said Lady Ashton. "It was I who, authorized alike by the laws of God and man, advised her and concurred with her to set aside an unhappy and precipitate engagement and to annul it by the authority of Scripture itself." "Scripture," said Ravenswood scornfully. "Let him hear the text," said Lady Ashton, appealing to the divine, "on which you yourself, with cautious reluctance, declared the nullity of the pretended engagement insisted upon by this violent man." The clergyman took his clasped Bible from his pocket and read the following words: "If a woman vow a vow unto the Lord, and bind herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father hear her vow, and her bond wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father shall hold his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every vow wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand, and every vow wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand." "And was it not even so with us?" interrupted Ravenswood. "Control thy impatience, young man," answered the divine, "and hear what follows in the sacred text. But if her father disallow her in the day that he heareth not any of her vows or of her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul, shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her, because her father disallowed her." "And was not," said Lady Ashton, fiercely and triumphantly breaking in, "was not ours the case stated in the Holy Writ? Will this person deny that the instant her parents heard of the vow or bond by which our daughter had bound her soul, we disallowed the same in the most express terms, and informed him by writing of our determination? And is this all?" said Ravenswood, looking at Lucy. "Are you willing to barter sworn faith, the exercise of free will, and the feelings of mutual affection to this wretched hypocritical sophistry?" "Hear him," said Lady Ashton, looking to the clergyman. "Hear the blasphemer." "May God forgive him," said Bide the Bent, "and enlighten his ignorance." "Hear what I have sacrificed for you," said Ravenswood, still addressing Lucy, "ere you sanction what has been done in your name. The honor of an ancient family, the urgent advice of my best friends, has been in vain use to sway my resolution. Neither the arguments of reason nor the portents of superstition have shaken my fidelity. The very dead have arisen to warn me, and their warning has been despised. Are you prepared to pierce my heart for its fidelity with the very weapon which my rash confidence entrusted to your grasp?" "Master of Ravenswood," said Lady Ashton, "you have asked what questions you thought fit. You see the total incapacity of my daughter to answer you. but I will reply for her, and in a manner which you cannot dispute. You desire to know whether Lucy Ashton, of her own free will, desires to annul the engagement into which she has been trepanned. You have her letter under her own hand, demanding the surrender of it, and in yet more full evidence of her purpose, here is the contract which she has this morning subscribed, in presence of this reverend gentleman, with Mr. Haston of Bucklaw. Ravenswood gazed upon the deed as if petrified. And it was without fraud or compulsion, said he, looking towards the clergyman, that Miss Ashton subscribed this parchment. I count it upon my sacred character. This is indeed, madam, an undeniable piece of evidence, said Ravenswood sternly, and it will be equally unnecessary and dishonorable to waste another word in useless remonstrance or reproach. There, madam, he said, laying down before Lucy the signed paper and the broken piece of gold. There are the evidences of your first engagement. May you be more faithful to that which you have just formed. I will trouble you to return the corresponding tokens of my ill-placed confidence. I ought rather to say of my egregious folly. Lucy returned the scornful glance of her lover with a gaze from which perception seemed to have been banished. Yet she seemed partly to have understood his meaning, for she raised her hands as if to undo a blue ribbon which she wore around her neck. She was unable to accomplish her purpose, but Lady Ashton cut the ribbon asunder, and detached the broken piece of gold which Miss Ashton had till then worn concealed in her bosom, the written counterpart of the lover's engagement she for some time had had in her own possession. With a haughty courtesy, she delivered both to Ravenswood, who was much softened when he took the piece of gold. And she could wear it thus, he said, speaking to himself, could wear it in her very bosom, could wear it next to her heart, even when, but complaint avails not, he said, dashing from his eye the tear which had gathered in it, and resuming the stern composure of his manner. He strolled to the chimney and threw into the fire the paper and piece of gold, stamping upon the coals with the heel of his boot as if to ensure their destruction. I will be no longer, he then said, an intruder here. Your evil wishes and your worse offices, Lady Ashton, I will only return by hoping these will be your last machinations against your daughter's honor and happiness. And to you, madam, he said, addressing Lucy, I have nothing farther to say except to pray to God that you may not become a world's wonder for this act of wilful and deliberate perjury. Having uttered these words, he turned on his heel and left the apartment. Sir William Ashton, by entreaty and authority, had detained his son in Bucklaw in a distant part of the castle, in order to prevent their again meeting with Ravenswood. But as the master descended the great staircase, Lockhart delivered him a billet, signed Sholto Douglas Ashton, requesting to know where the master of Ravenswood would be heard of 4 or 5 days from. Hence, as the writer had business of weight to settle with him, so soon as an important family event had taken place. Tell Colonel Ashton, said Ravenswood composedly, I shall be found at Wolf's Crag when his leisure serves him. As he descended the outward stair which led from the terrace, he was a second time interrupted by Craigengelt, who, on the part of his principal, the Laird of Bucklaw, expressed a hope that Ravenswood would not leave Scotland within 10 days at least, as he had both former and recent civilities for which to express his gratitude. Tell your master, said Ravenswood fiercely, to choose his own time. He will find me at Wolf's Crag if his purpose is not forestalled. My master, replied Craigengelt, encouraged by seeing Colonel Ashton and Bucklaw at the bottom of the terrace. Give me leave to say I know of no such person upon earth, nor will I permit such language to be used to me. Seek your master then in hell, exclaimed Ravenswood, giving way to the passion he had hitherto restrained, and throwing Craigengelt from him with such violence that he rolled down the steps and lay senseless at the foot of them. I am a fool, he instantly added, to vent my passion upon a caitiff so worthless. He then mounted his horse, which at his arrival he had secured to a balustrade in front of the castle, rode very slowly past Bucklaw and Colonel Ashton, raising his hat as he passed each and looking in their faces steadily while he offered this mute salutation, which was returned by both with the same stern gravity. Ravenswood walked on with equal deliberation until he reached the head of the avenue, as if to show that he rather courted than interruption. When he had passed the upper gate, he turned his horse and looked at the castle with a fixed eye, then set spurs to his good steed and departed with the speed of a demon dismissed by the exorcist. Chapter 34. After the dreadful scene that had taken place at the castle, Lucy was transported to her own chamber, where she remained for some time in a state of absolute stupor. Yet afterwards, in the course of the ensuing day, she seemed to have recovered not merely her spirits and resolution, but a sort of flighty levity that was foreign to her character and situation, and which was at times checkered by fits of deep silence and melancholy, and of capricious pettishness. Lady Ashton became much alarmed and consulted the family physicians, but as her pulse indicated no change, they could only say that the disease was on the spirits and recommended gentle exercise and amusement. Miss Ashton never alluded to what had passed in the stateroom. It seemed doubtful even if she was conscious of it, for she was often observed to raise her hands to her neck as if in search of the ribbon that had been taken from it, and mutter, in surprise and discontent, when she could not find it, "It was the link that bound me to life." Notwithstanding all these remarkable symptoms, Lady Ashton was too deeply pledged to delay her daughter's marriage even in her present state of health. It cost her much trouble to keep up the fair side of appearances towards Bucklaw. She was well aware that if he once saw any reluctance on her daughter's part, he would break off the treaty, to her great personal shame and dishonor. She therefore resolved that, if Lucy continued passive, the marriage should take place upon the day that had been previously fixed, trusting that a change of place, of situation, and of character would operate a more speedy and effectual cure upon the unsettled spirits of her daughter than could be attained by the slow measures which the medical men recommended. Sir William Ashton's views of family aggrandizement, and his desire to strengthen himself against the measures of the Marquis of A, readily induced him to acquiesce in what he could not have perhaps resisted if willing to do so. As for the young men, Bucklaw and Colonel Ashton, they protested that, after what had happened, it would be most dishonorable to postpone for a single hour the time appointed for the marriage, as it would be generally ascribed to their being intimidated by the intrusive visit and threats of Ravenswood. Bucklaw would indeed have been incapable of such precipitation had he been aware of the state of Miss Ashton's health, or rather of her mind. But custom, upon these occasions, permitted only brief and sparing intercourse between the bridegroom and the betrothed, a circumstance so well improved by Lady Ashton that Bucklaw neither saw nor suspected the real state of the health and feelings of his unhappy bride. On the eve of the bridal day, Lucy appeared to have one of her fits of levity, and surveyed with a degree of girlish interest the various preparations of dress, etc., which the different members of the family had prepared for the occasion. The morning dawned bright and cheerily. The bridal guests assembled in gallant troops from distant quarters, not only the relations of Sir William Ashton and the still more dignified connections of his lady, together with the numerous kinsmen and allies of the bridegroom, were present upon this joyful ceremony, gallantly mounted, arrayed, and caparisoned. But almost every Presbyterian family of distinction within 50 miles made a point of attendance upon an occasion which was considered as giving a sort of triumph over the Marquis of A in the person of his kinsman. Splendid refreshments awaited the guests on their arrival, and after these were finished, the cry was, "To horse!" The bride was led forth betwixt her brother Henry and her mother. Her gaiety of the preceding day had given place to a deep shade of melancholy, which, however, did not misbecome an occasion so momentous. There was a light in her eyes and the color in her cheek which had not been kindled for many a day, and which, joined to her great beauty, and the splendor of her dress occasioned her entrance to be greeted with an universal murmur of applause, in which even the ladies could not refrain from joining. While the cavalcade were getting to horse, Sir William Ashton, a man of peace and of form, censured his son Henry for having begirt himself with a military sword of preposterous length, belonging to his brother, Colonel Ashton. "If you must have a weapon," he said, "upon such a peaceful occasion, why did you not use the short poniard sent from Edinburgh on purpose?" The boy vindicated himself by saying it was lost. "You put it out of the way yourself, I suppose," said his father, "out of ambition to wear that preposterous thing, which might have served Sir William Wallace. But never mind, get to horse now, and take care of your sister." The boy did so, and was placed in the center of the gallant train. At the time, he was too full of his own appearance, his sword, his laced cloak, his feathered hat, and his managed horse, to pay much regard to anything else. But he afterwards remembered to the hour of his death that when the hand of his sister, by which she supported herself on the pillion behind him, touched his own, it felt as wet and cold as sepulchral marble. Glancing wide over hill and dale, the fair bridal procession at last reached the parish church, which they nearly filled. For besides domestics, above 100 gentlemen and ladies were present upon the occasion. The marriage ceremony was performed according to the rites of the Presbyterian persuasion, to which Bucklaw of late had judged it proper to conform. On the outside of the church, a liberal dole was distributed to the poor of the neighboring parishes under the direction of Johnny Mortish Hugh, who had lately been promoted from his desolate quarters at the Hermitage to fill the more eligible situation of sexton at the parish church of Ravenswood. Dame Gourlay, with 2 of her contemporaries, the same who assisted at Alice's late wake, seated apart upon a flat monument, or through stain, sate enviously comparing the shares which had been allotted to them in dividing the dole. "Johnny Mortuch," said Annie Winnie, "might he minded auld lang syne, and thought of his auld kimmers, for as braw as he is with his new black coat. I ye gotten but 5 herring instead o' 6, and this dista look like a good as saxpennys, and I dare say this bit morsel of beef is an unsay lighter than ony that's been dealt round, and it's a bit o' the tineny hoe, mair by token that yours, Maggie, is out o' the back say." "Mine," quo' she, mumbled the paralytic hag, "mine is half banes, I trow. If grit folks gie poor bodies ony thing for coming to their weddings and burials, it's be something that wad do them goodie, I think." "Their gifts," said Elsie Gourlay, "are dealt for nae love of us, nor out of respect for whether we feed or starve. They wad gie us whinstanes for loaves, if it would. Serve their ain't vanity, and yet they expect us to be as grateful as they ca' it, as if they served us for true love and liking." "And that's truly said," answered her companion. "But, Isly Gourlay, you're the oldest o' us 3. Did ye ever see a mair grand bridal?" "I winna say that I have," answered the hag, "but I think soon to see as braw a burial." "And that wad please me as weel," said Annie Winnie, "for there's as lart a dole, and folk are no obliged to girn and laugh, and mak mergens, and wish joy to these hellicat quality, that lord it ower us like brute beasts. I like to pack the dead dole in my lap and rin ower my old rhyme. My loaf in my lap, my penny in my purse, thou art ne'er the better, and I'm near the worse." "That's right, Annie," said the paralytic woman. "God send us a green Yule and a fat kirkyard. But I wad like to ken, Lucky Gourlay, for you're the oldest and wisest among us, whilk o' these revellers' turn it will be to be streaked first." "Die see yon dandilly maiden," said Dame Gourlay, "a glistenin' wi' gowd and jewels, that they are lifting up on the white horse behind that hare-brained callant in scarlet with the lang sword at his side." "But that's the bride," said her companion, her cold heart touched with some sort of compassion. "That's the very bride hersel. How? Say young, say braw, and say bonny, and is her time say short? I tell ye, said the Sibyl, her winding sheet is up as high as her throat already. Believe it wha list. Her sand has but few grains to rin out, and nae wonder they've been weel shaken. The leaves are withering fast on the trees, but she'll never see the Martinmas Wingarthen dance in swirls like the fairy rings. Ye waited on her for a quarter, said the paralytic woman, and got 2 red pieces, or I am far beguiled. Aye, answered Ailsie with a bitter grin, and Sir William Ashton promised me a bonny red gown to the boot o' that, a stake and a chain and a tar-barrel, lass. What think ye o' that for propine? For being up early and down late for 80 nights, and mair wi' his dwining daughter. But he may keep it for his Aunt Letty cummers. I hae heard a sow, said Annie Winnie, as if Letty Ashton was nae canny body. I see her yonder, said Don Gourlay, as she prances on her grey gelding out at the kirkyard. There's mair o' utter de devilry in that woman, as brave and fair-fashioned as she rides yonder, than in a Scotch withies that ever flew by moonlight hour north Berwick Law. What's that you say about witches, ye damned hags? Said Johnny Morthauch. Morshew, are ye casting your cantrips in the very kirkyard to misachieve the bride and bridegroom? Get awa hammy, for if I tack my supple tie, I'll gar you find the road faster than ye wad like. Sirs, answered Ailsie Gourlay, how bray are we wi' our new black coat and our weel powdered head, as if we had never kenned hunger nor thirst ourselves. And we'll be screwing up our bit fiddle, doubtless, in the night among the other elbow jiggers for miles round. Let's see if the pin's haud, Johnny. That's lad. I take ye to witness, good people, said Morthauch, that she threatens me with chief and forspeaks me. If ony thing but good happens to me, or my fiddle this night, I'll make it the blackest night's job she ever stirred in. I'll hae her before presbytery and synod. I'm half a minister mysel, now that I'm a bedrawl in an inhabited parish. Although the mutual hatred betwixt these hags and the rest of mankind had steeled their hearts against all impressions of festivity, this was by no means the case with the multitude at large. The splendor of the bridal retinue, the gay dresses, the spirited horses, the blithesome appearance of the handsome women and gallant gentlemen assembled upon the occasion, had the usual effect upon the minds of the populace. The repeated shouts of Ashton and Bucklaw forever, the discharge of pistols, guns, and musketoons, to give what was called the bridal shot, evinced the interest the people took in the occasion of the cavalcade, as they accompanied it upon their return to the castle. If there was here and there an elder peasant or his wife who sneered at the pomp of the upstart family, and remembered the days of the long-descended Ravenswoods, even they, attracted by the plentiful cheer which the castle that day afforded to rich and poor, held their way thither, and acknowledged, notwithstanding their prejudices, the influence of l'Amphitryon Ulua Longine. Thus, accompanied with the attendance both of rich and poor, Lucy returned to her father's house. Bucklaw used his privilege of riding next to the bride, but, new to such a situation, rather endeavored to attract attention by the display of his person and horsemanship than by any attempt to address her in private. They reached the castle in safety, amid 1,000 joyous acclamations. It is well known that the weddings of ancient days were celebrated with a festive publicity rejected by the delicacy of modern times. The marriage guests on the present occasion were regaled with a banquet of unbounded profusion, the relics of which, after the domestics had feasted in their turn, were distributed among the shouting crowd with as many barrels of ale as made the hilarity without correspond to that within the castle. The gentlemen, according to the fashion of the times, indulged, for the most part, in deep draughts of the richest wines, while the ladies, prepared for the ball which always closed a bridal entertainment, impatiently expected their arrival in the state gallery. At length the social party broke up at a late hour, and the gentlemen crowded into the saloon where, enlivened by wine and the joyful occasion, they laid aside their swords and handed their impatient partners to the floor. The music already rung from the gallery along the fretted roof of the ancient state apartment. According to strict etiquette, the bride ought to have opened the ball, but Lady Ashton, making an apology on account of her daughter's health, offered her own hand to Bucklaw as substitute for her daughter's. But as Lady Ashton raised her head gracefully, expecting the strain at which she was to begin the dance, she was so much struck by an unexpected alteration in the ornaments of the apartment that she was surprised into an exclamation, "Who has dared to change the pictures?" All looked up, and those who knew the usual state of the apartment observed, with surprise, that the picture of Sir William Ashton's father was removed from its place, and in its stead that of old Sir Lucy Ravenswood seemed to frown, wrath and vengeance upon the party assembled below. The exchange must have been made while the apartments were empty, but had not been observed until the torches and lights in the sconces were kindled for the ball. The haughty and heated spirits of the gentlemen led them to demand an immediate inquiry into the cause of what they deemed an affront to their host and to themselves. But Lady Ashton, recovering herself, passed it over as the freak of a crazy wench who was maintained about the castle, and whose susceptible imagination had been observed to be much affected by the stories which Dame Gourlay delighted to tell concerning the former family. So Lady Ashton named the Ravenswoods. The obnoxious picture was immediately removed, and the ball was opened by Lady Ashton with a grace and dignity which supplied the charms of youth and almost verified the extravagant encomiums of the elder part of the company, who extolled her performance as far exceeding the dancing of the rising generation. When Lady Ashton sat down, she was not surprised to find that her daughter had left the apartment, and she herself followed, eager to obviate any impression which might have been made upon her nerves by an incident so likely to affect them as the mysterious transposition of the portraits. Apparently, she found her apprehensions groundless, for she returned in about an hour and whispered the bridegroom, who extricated himself from the dancers and vanished from the apartment. The instruments now played their loudest strains. The dancers pursued their exercise with all the enthusiasm inspired by youth, mirth, and high spirits, when a cry was heard so shrill and piercing as at once to arrest the dance and the music. All stood motionless, but when the yell was again repeated, Colonel Ashton snatched a torch from the sconce, and demanding the key of the bridal chamber from Henry, to whom, as bridesman, it had been entrusted, rushed thither, followed by Sir William Ashton and Lady Ashton, and one or two others, near relations of the family. The bridal guests waited their return in stupefied amazement. Arrived at the door of the apartment, Colonel Ashton knocked and called, but received no answer except stifled groans. He hesitated no longer to open the door of the apartment, in which he found opposition from something which lay against it. When he had succeeded in opening it, the body of the bridegroom was found lying on the threshold of the bridal chamber, and all around was flooded with blood. A cry of surprise and horror was raised by all present, and the company, excited by this new alarm, began to rush tumultuously towards the sleeping apartment. Colonel Ashton, first whispering to his mother, "Search for her, she has murdered him," drew his sword, planted himself in the passage, and declared he would suffer no man to pass excepting the clergyman and a medical person present. By their assistance, Bucklaw, who still breathed, was raised from the ground and transported to another apartment, where his friends, full of suspicion and murmuring, assembled round him to learn the opinion of the surgeon. In the meanwhile, Lady Ashton, her husband, and their assistants in vain sought Lucy in the bridal bed and in the chamber. There was no private passage from the room, and they began to think that she must have thrown herself from the window, when one of the company, holding his torch lower than the rest, discovered something white in the corner of the great old-fashioned chimney of the apartment. Here they found the unfortunate girl seated, or rather couched, like a hare upon its form, her headgear disheveled, her nightclothes torn and dabbled with blood, her eyes glazed, and her features convulsed into a wild paroxysm of insanity. When she saw herself discovered, she gibbered, made mouths, and pointed at them with her bloody fingers with the frantic gestures of an exulting demoniac. Female assistance was now hastily summoned. The unhappy bride was overpowered, not without the use of some force. As they carried her over the threshold, she looked down and uttered the only articulate words that she had yet spoken, saying, with a sort of grinning exultation, "So, you've ta'en up your bonny bridegroom?" She was, by the shuddering assistants, conveyed to another and more retired apartment, where she was secured as her situation required and closely watched. The unutterable agony of the parents, the horror and confusion of all who were in the castle, the fury of contending passions between the friends of the different parties, passions augmented by previous intemperance, surpassed description. The surgeon was the first who obtained something like a patient hearing. He pronounced that the wound of Bucklaw, though severe and dangerous, was by no means fatal, but might readily be rendered so by disturbance and hasty removal. This silenced the numerous party of Bucklaw's friends, who had previously insisted that he should, at all rates, be transported from the castle to the nearest of their houses. They still demanded, however, that, in consideration of what had happened, 4 of their number should remain to watch over the sick-bed of their friend, and that a suitable number of their domestics, well armed, should also remain in the castle. This condition being acceded to on the part of Colonel Ashton and his father, the rest of the bridegroom's friends left the castle, notwithstanding the hour and the darkness of the night. The cares of the medical man were next employed in behalf of Miss Ashton, whom he pronounced to be in a very dangerous state. Farther medical assistance was immediately summoned. All night she remained delirious. On the morning she fell into a state of absolute insensibility. The next evening the physician said would be the crisis of her malady. It proved so. For although she awoke from her trance with some appearance of calmness, and suffered her nightclothes to be changed or put in order, yet so soon as she put her hand to her neck, as if to search for the fatal blue ribbon, a tide of recollection seemed to rush upon her, which her mind and body were alike incapable of bearing. Convulsion followed convulsion, till they closed in death, without her being able to utter a word explanatory of the fatal scene. The provincial judge of the district arrived the day after the young lady had expired, and executed, though with all possible delicacy to the afflicted family, the painful duty of inquiring into this fatal transaction. But there occurred nothing to explain the general hypothesis that the bride, in a sudden fit of insanity, had stabbed the bridegroom at the threshold of the apartment. The fatal weapon was found in the chamber smeared with blood. It was the same poniard which Henry should have worn on the wedding day, and the unhappy sister had probably contrived to secrete on the preceding evening, when it had been shown to her among other articles of preparation for the wedding. The friends of Bucklaw expected that on his recovery he would throw some light upon this dark story, and eagerly pressed him with inquiries, which for some time he evaded under pretext of weakness. When, however, he had been transported to his own house, and was considered in a state of convalescence, he assembled those persons, both male and female, who had considered themselves as entitled to press him on the subject, and returned them thanks for the interest they had exhibited in his behalf, and their offers of adherence and support. "I wish you all," he said, "my friends, to understand, however, that I have neither story to tell, nor injuries to avenge. If a lady shall question me henceforward upon the incident of that unhappy night, I shall remain silent, and in future consider her as one who has shown herself desirous to break off her friendship with me. In a word, I will never speak to her again. But if a gentleman shall ask me the same question, I shall regard the incivility as equivalent to an invitation to meet him in the Duke's Walk, and I expect that he will rule himself accordingly." A declaration so decisive admitted no commentary, and it was soon after seen that Bucklaw had arisen from the bed of sickness a sadder and a wiser man than he had hitherto shown himself. He dismissed Craigengelt from his society, but not without such a provision as, if well employed, might secure him against indigence and against temptation. Bucklaw afterwards went abroad and never returned to Scotland, nor was he known ever to hint at the circumstances attending his fatal marriage. By many readers this may be deemed overstrained, romantic, and composed by the wild imagination of an author desirous of gratifying the popular appetite for the horrible, but those who are read in the private family history of Scotland during the period in which the scene is laid will readily discover, through the disguise of borrowed names and added incidents, the leading particulars of Orteol tale. Chapter 35. We have anticipated the course of time to mention Bucklaw's recovery and fate, that we might not interrupt the detail of events which succeeded the funeral of the unfortunate Lucy Ashton. This melancholy ceremony was performed in the misty dawn of an autumnal morning, with such moderate attendance and ceremony as could not possibly be dispensed with. A very few of the nearest relations attended her body to the same churchyard to which she had so lately been led as a bride, with as little free will, perhaps, as could be now testified by her lifeless and passive remains. An aisle adjacent to the church had been fitted up by Sir William Ashton as a family cemetery, and here, in a coffin bearing neither name nor date, were consigned to dust the remains of what was once lovely, beautiful, and innocent, though exasperated to frenzy by a long tract of unremitting persecution. While the mourners were busy in the vault, the 3 village hags who, notwithstanding the unwonted earliness of the hour, had snuffed the carrion like vultures, were seated on the through-stane and engaged in their wonted unhallowed conference. "Did not I say," said Dame Gourlay, "that the braw bridal would be followed by as braw a funeral?" "I think," answered Dame Winnie, "there's little bravery at it, neither meat nor drink, and just a wheen silver tippences to the poor folk. It was little worth while to come sae far a road for sae sma profit, and us sae frail." "Out, wretch," replied Dame Gourlay, "can the dainties they could gie us be half sae sweet as this hour's vengeance? There they are, that were capering on their prancing nags 4 days since, and they are now ganging as dray and sober as ourselves the day. They were a glistening white gowd in silver, they are now as black as the crook. And Miss Lucy Ashton, that grudged when an honest woman came near her, a tade may sit on her coffin that day, and she can never scunner when he croaks. And Lady Ashton has hell fire burning in her breast by this time, and Sir William, wi' his gibbets and his faggots and his chains, how likes he the witcheries of his ain dwelling house?" "And is it true, then," mumbled the paralytic wretch, "that the bride was trailed out of her bed and up the chimley by evil spirits, and that the bridegroom's face was wrung round ahint him?" "Yet needna care wha did it, or how it was done," said Astley Gourlay, "but I'll have had it for nae stickit job, and that the lairds and leddies can weel this day." "And was it true," said Annie Winnie, "sin ye ken sae muckle about it, that the picture of auld Sir Malise Ravenswood came down on the ha' floor and let out the brawl before them a'?" "Na," said Ailsie, "but into the ha' came the picture, and I ken weel how it came." There did ye them a warning that pride wad get a fa. But there's as queer a ploy, cummers, as ony a thay, that's gone on even now in the burial vault yonder. Ye saw 12 mourners, wi' crape and cloak, gang down the steps, pair and pair. "What should ail us to see them?" said the one old woman. "I counted them," said the other, with the eagerness of a person to whom the spectacle had afforded too much interest to be viewed with indifference. "But ye did not see," said Ailsie, exulting in her superior observation, "that there's a 13th amang them that they ken naething about, and if old Freet say true, there's an ane o' that company that'll no be lang for this world." But come awa, comers. If we bide here, I's warrant we get the whito, whatever ill comes of it, and that good will come of it nane o' them me'd ever think to see. And thus croaking like the ravens when they anticipate pestilence, the ill boding sibyls withdrew from the churchyard. In fact, the mourners, when the service of interment was ended, discovered that there was among them one more than the invited number, and the remark was communicated in whispers to each other. The suspicion fell upon a figure which, muffled in the same deep mourning with the others, was reclined, almost in a state of insensibility, against one of the pillars of the sepulchral vault. The relatives of the Ashton family were expressing in whispers their surprise and displeasure at the intrusion, when they were interrupted by Colonel Ashton, who in his father's absence acted as principal mourner. "I know," he said in a whisper, "who this person is. He has, or shall soon have, as deep cause of mourning as ourselves. Leave me to deal with him, and do not disturb the ceremony by unnecessary exposure." So saying, he separated himself from the group of his relations, and taking the unknown mourner by the cloak, he said to him, in a tone of suppressed emotion, "Follow me." The stranger, as if starting from a trance at the sound of his voice, mechanically obeyed, and they ascended the broken ruinous stair which led from the sepulchre into the churchyard. The other mourners followed, but remained grouped together at the door of the vault, watching with anxiety the motions of Colonel Ashton and the stranger, who now appeared to be in close conference beneath the shade of a yew tree, in the most remote part of the burial ground. To this sequestered spot Colonel Ashton had guided the stranger, and then turning round, addressed him in a stern and composed tone. "I cannot doubt that I speak to the Master of Ravenswood." No answer was returned. "I cannot doubt," resumed the colonel, trembling with rising passion, "that I speak to the murderer of my sister." "You have named me but too truly," said Ravenswood in a hollow and tremulous voice. "If you repent what you have done," said the colonel, "may your penitence avail you before God. With me it shall serve you nothing. Here," he said, giving a paper, "is the measure of my sword, and a memorandum of the time and place of meeting. Sunrise tomorrow morning, on the links to the east of Wolf's Hope." The Master of Ravenswood held the paper in his hand and seemed irresolute. At length he spoke. "Do not," he said, "urge to farther desperation a wretch who is already desperate. Enjoy your life while you can, and let me seek my death from another." "That you never, never shall," said Douglas Ashton. "You shall die by my hand, or you shall complete the ruin of my family by taking my life. If you refuse my open challenge, there is no advantage I will not take of you, no indignity with which I will not load you, until the very name of Ravenswood shall be the sign of everything that is dishonorable, as it is already of all that is villainous." "That it shall never be," said Ravenswood fiercely. "If I am the last who must bear it, I owe it to those who once owned it, that the name shall be extinguished without infamy. I accept your challenge, time and place of meeting. We meet, I presume, alone?" "Alone we meet," said Colonel Ashton, "and alone will the survivor of us return from that place of rendezvous." "Then God have mercy on the soul of him who falls," said Ravenswood. "So be it," said Colonel Ashton. "So far can my charity reach even for the man I hate most deadly, and with the deepest reason. Now break off, for we shall be interrupted. The links by the seashore to the east of Wolf's Hope, the hour, sunrise, our swords, our only weapons." "Enough," said the master. "I will not fail you." They separated, Colonel Ashton joining the rest of the mourners, and the Master of Ravenswood taking his horse, which was tied to a tree behind the church. Colonel Ashton returned to the castle with the funeral guests, but found a pretext for detaching himself from them in the evening, when, changing his dress to a riding habit, he rode to Wolf's Hope that night, and took up his abode in the little inn, in order that he might be ready for his rendezvous in the morning. It is not known how the master of Ravenswood disposed of the rest of that unhappy day. Late at night, however, he arrived at Wolf's Crag and aroused his old domestic, Caleb Balderstone, who had ceased to expect his return. Confused and flying rumors of the late tragical death of Miss Ashton and of its mysterious cause had already reached the old man, who was filled with the utmost anxiety on account of the probable effect these events might produce upon the mind of his master. The conduct of Ravenswood did not alleviate his apprehensions. To the butler's trembling entreaties that he would take some refreshment, he at first returned no answer, and then suddenly and fiercely demanding wine, he drank, contrary to his habits, a very large draught. Seeing that his master would eat nothing, the old man affectionately entreated that he would permit him to light him to his chamber. It was not until the request was 3 or 4 times repeated that Ravenswood made a mute sign of compliance. But when Balderstone conducted him to an apartment which had been comfortably fitted up, and which, since his return, he had usually occupied, Ravenswood stopped short on the threshold. "Not here," said he sternly. "Show me the room in which my father died, the room in which C slept the night they were at the castle." "Who, sir?" said Caleb, too terrified to preserve his presence of mind. "She, Lucy Ashton. Would you kill me, old man, by forcing me to repeat her?" "Name?" Caleb would have said something of the disrepair of the chamber, but was silenced by the irritable impatience which was expressed in his master's countenance. He lighted the way, trembling and in silence, placed the lamp on the table of the deserted room, and was about to attempt some arrangement of the bed, when his master bid him begone in a tone that admitted of no delay. The old man retired not to rest but to prayer, and from time to time crept to the door of the apartment, in order to find out whether Ravenswood had gone to repose. His measured heavy step upon the floor was only interrupted by deep groans, and the repeated stamps of the heel of his heavy boot intimated too clearly that the wretched inmate was abandoning himself at such moments to paroxysms of uncontrolled agony. The old man thought that the morning for which he longed would never have dawned, but time, whose course rolls on with equal current, however it may seem more rapid or more slow to mortal apprehension, brought the dawn at last, and spread a ruddy light on the broad verge of the glistening ocean. It was early in November, and the weather was serene for the season of the year. But an easterly wind had prevailed during the night, and the advancing tide rolled nearer than usual to the foot of the crags on which the castle was founded. With the first peep of light, Caleb Balderstone again resorted to the door of Ravenswood's sleeping apartment, through a chink of which he observed him engaged in measuring the length of 2 or 3 swords which lay in a closet adjoining to the apartment. He muttered to himself as he selected one of these weapons, "It is shorter, let him have this advantage, as he has every other." Caleb Balderstone knew too well, from what he witnessed, upon what enterprise his master was bound, and how vain all interference on his part must necessarily prove. He had but time to retreat from the door, so nearly was he. Surprised by his master suddenly coming out and descending to the stables, the faithful domestic followed, and from the disheveled appearance of his master's dress and his ghastly looks, was confirmed in his conjecture that he had passed the night without sleep or repose. He found him busily engaged in saddling his horse, a service from which Caleb, though with faltering voice and trembling hands, offered to relieve him. Ravenswood rejected his assistance by a mute sign, and having led the animal into the court, was just about to mount him, when the old domestic's fear giving way to the strong attachment which was the principal passion of his mind, he flung himself suddenly at Ravenswood's feet and clasped his knees, while he exclaimed, "Oh, sir! Oh, master! Kill me if you will, but do not go out on this dreadful errand. Oh, my dear master, wait but this day. The Marquis of A comes tomorrow, and it will be remedied." "You have no longer a master, Caleb," said Ravenswood, endeavoring to extricate himself. "Why, old man, would you cling to a falling tower? "But I have a master," cried Caleb, still holding him fast, "while the heir of Ravenswood breathes. I am but a servant, but I was born your father's, your grandfather's servant. I was born for the family, I have lived for them, I would die for them. Stay, but at home, and all will be well." "Well, fool, well," said Ravenswood. "Vain old man, nothing hereafter in life will be well with me, and happiest is the hour that shall soonest close it." So saying, he extricated himself from the old man's hold, threw himself on his horse, and rode out the gate, but instantly turning back, he threw towards Caleb, who hastened to meet him, a heavy purse of gold. "Caleb," he said, with a ghastly smile, "I make you my executor," and again turning his bridle, he resumed his course down the hill. The gold fell unheeded on the pavement, for the old man ran to observe the course which was taken by his master, who turned to the left down a small and broken path, which gained the seashore through a cleft in the rock, and led to a sort of cove where, in former times, the boats of the castle were wont to be moored. Observing him take this course, Caleb hastened to the eastern battlement, which commanded the prospect of the whole sands, very near as far as the village of Wolf's Hope. He could easily see his master riding in that direction as fast as the horse could carry him. The prophecy at once rushed on Balderstone's mind that the Lord of Ravenswood should perish on the Kelpie's flow, which lay halfway betwixt the tower and the links, or sand knolls, to the northward of Wolf's Hope. He saw him according reach the fatal spot, but he never saw him pass further. Colonel Ashton, frantic for revenge, was already in the field, pacing the turf with eagerness, and looking with impatience towards the tower for the arrival of his antagonist. The sun had now risen, and showed its broad disk above the eastern sea, so that he could easily discern the horseman who rode towards him with speed, which argued impatience equal to his own. At once the figure became invisible, as if it had melted into the air. He rubbed his eyes, as if he had witnessed an apparition, and then hastened to the spot near which he was met by Balderstone, who came from the opposite direction. No trace whatever of horse or rider could be discerned. It only appeared that the late winds and high tides had greatly extended the usual bounds of the quicksand, and that the unfortunate horseman, as appeared from the hoof tracks, in his precipitate haste, had not attended to keep on the firm sands on the foot of the rock, but had taken the shortest and most dangerous course. One only vestige of his fate appeared. A large sable feather had been detached from his hat, and the rippling waves of the rising tide wafted it to Caleb's feet. The old man took it up, dried it, and placed it in his bosom. The inhabitants of Wolf's Hope were now alarmed, and crowded to the place, some on shore and some in boats, but their search availed nothing. The tenacious depths of the quicksand, as is usual in such cases, retained its prey. Our tale draws to a conclusion. The Marquis of A., alarmed at the frightful reports that were current, and anxious for his kinsman's safety, arrived on the subsequent day to mourn his loss, and, after renewing in vain a search for the body, returned to forget what had happened amid the bustle of politics and state affairs. Not so Caleb Balderstone. If worldly profit could have consoled the old man, his age was better provided for than his earlier years had ever been, but life had lost to him its salt and its savor. His whole course of ideas, his feelings, whether of pride or of apprehension, of pleasure or of pain, had all arisen from its close connection with the family which was now extinguished. He held up his head no longer, forsook all his usual haunts and occupations, and seemed only to find pleasure in moping about those apartments in the old castle which the master of Ravenswood had last inhabited. He ate without refreshment, and slumbered without repose, and, with a fidelity sometimes displayed by the canine race, but seldom by human beings, he pined and died within a year after the catastrophe which we have narrated. The family of Ashton did not long survive that of Ravenswood. Sir William Ashton outlived his eldest son, the colonel, who was slain in a duel in Flanders, and Henry, by whom he was succeeded, died unmarried. Lady Ashton lived to the verge of extreme old age, the only survivor of the group of unhappy persons whose misfortunes were owing to her implacability. That she might internally feel compunction and reconcile herself with heaven, whom she had offended, we will not and we dare not deny. But to those around her she did not evince the slightest symptom either of repentance or remorse. In all external appearance she bore the same bold, haughty, unbending character which she had displayed before these unhappy events. A splendid marble monument records her name, titles, and virtues, while her victims remain undistinguished by tomb or epitaph. Itch chapters. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.